She had 11,47 left in her bank account. Rent was due in 3 days. Her brother needed medication she couldn't afford. And yet, when the man in front of her at the register watched his card get declined, when his 6-year-old daughter tugged his sleeve and whispered, "Daddy, are we okay?" Claire Bennett didn't hesitate. She reached into the worn pocket of her apron and paid for a stranger's breakfast. She never expected to see him again. She had no idea that single moment, that one quiet, unremarkable act of human decency, was about to tear her entire life apart. If this story stays with you, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. The cold came early that year. Not the kind of cold that makes people romantic about autumn. Not the golden, scarf and cider kind that fills up Instagram feeds with leaf photos and pumpkin everything. This was the grinding kind. The kind that crawled under doors and seeped through old window frames and made Claire Bennett's commute feel like a punishment she hadn't earned. She walked the 6 blocks from her apartment to the cafe every morning because she couldn't justify the bus fare on days she didn't absolutely need to. 6 blocks wasn't far. She kept telling herself that. 6 blocks in November wind with a jacket that had a broken zipper and a hole in the left pocket was a different calculation, but she'd stopped doing that math a long time ago. Doing that math didn't get her anywhere except angry. Magnolia Morning Cafe had been open since 1987, according to the wooden sign above the door that nobody had repainted in at least a decade. The letters were faded enough that from the street it looked like it said Magnolia Morning Caf, which somehow made Claire love it more. There was something honest about a sign that didn't pretend to be more than it was. She pushed through the front door at 5:48 a.m., 12 minutes before her shift technically started, because showing up exactly on time felt rude, and showing up late felt like dying. "You're early," said Deb. Deb Kowalski was 61 years old and had been managing the morning shift at Magnolia Morning for longer than Claire had been alive. She had short silver hair she kept tucked behind both ears, reading glasses that lived permanently on top of her head even when she was actively reading with them, and a voice that could cut through a crowded cafe like a fire alarm. She wasn't warm in the obvious way. She didn't hug, didn't compliment unprompted, didn't do small talk unless the small talk had a purpose. But she'd covered Claire's shifts twice without being asked when Claire's brother Marcus had his bad stretch in September, and she kept a spare granola bar in her apron pocket specifically for the days she noticed Claire skipping breakfast. "I'm always early," Claire said, tying her apron. "You're always something," Deb said, not unkindly. The cafe filled up on its usual schedule. The 6 a.m. crowd was construction workers and nurses coming off night shifts. The 7 a.m. crowd was office people who needed something in their hands before they could make eye contact with anyone. By 8:30, the rhythm smoothed out, the rush settled into a hum, and Claire stopped counting orders and started moving on instinct the way she did when the morning clicked into gear. She'd been waitressing here for 2.5 years. Before that, it was the diner on Broadway. Before that, it was a chain place near the university where she'd briefly enrolled in an education program before the money ran out the second time. She still taught art on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons at the community center 2 miles east, a part-time position that paid her $60 per session and that she would have done for free if it ever came to that, which she sometimes worried it might. She was good at her job, not in a performative tips-fishing way. She didn't do the crouching down to your level thing or the "my name is Claire and I'll be taking care of you today" voice. She just paid attention. She noticed when somebody's coffee had gone cold and replaced it before they asked. She remembered that the man in the corner booth on Tuesdays took his eggs scrambled dry and got annoyed when they came out wet. She knew which regulars wanted conversation and which ones wanted to be left alone with their newspaper, and she honored both preferences without making anyone feel like they were being managed. It wasn't a calling. She'd never tell anyone it was a calling, but it was honest work, it was hers, and on the good days, it was enough. The man came in at 9:17. Claire noticed him for 2 reasons. First, because he came in alone, but wasn't alone. There was a small girl holding his left hand, pressing close against his leg, the way children do when they're not sure about a new place. The girl was maybe 5 or 6, with dark brown hair pulled into 2 uneven pigtails that suggested someone had tried their best without much practice. She had on a red coat with a missing button at the collar and small boots that were slightly too big, the kind of boots you buy a size up so they last through the season. Second, because the man himself looked exactly like someone who did not want to be looked at. He wasn't disheveled. He wasn't visibly distressed. His jacket was plain, dark navy, the kind you could buy at any mid-range outdoors store. and his jeans were worn at the knees in the way that comes from actual use rather than deliberate styling. He was tall, broad-shouldered in a quiet way, with dark hair that needed a cut and a jaw that hadn't been shaved in probably 4 days. He wasn't trying to disappear exactly. He just carried himself like someone who had spent a long time learning how to take up less space. He stood at the entrance for a second, scanning the room the way people do when they've walked into somewhere unfamiliar. The little girl tugged his hand and pointed at a two-top near the window. He nodded and let her lead him there. Claire gave them a few minutes before she came over. The girl was already studying the laminated menu with the intense focus of someone making a genuinely important decision. The man wasn't looking at anything in particular. He was just sitting, hands flat on the table, not on his phone, not reading, just sitting, staring at the middle distance like he was somewhere else entirely. "Hey," Claire said, pulling out her order pad out of habit, even though she rarely actually wrote anything down. "What can I get you?" The girl looked up from the menu immediately. "Can I have hot chocolate?" "You can absolutely have hot chocolate," Claire smiled. "We make it with real milk, not the powder kind, just so you know." The girl considered this gravely. "That's better," she decided. "It really is." Claire looked up at the man. He was watching his daughter with an expression she couldn't quite name. Something soft and tired and careful all at once, like he was trying to memorize her. "Coffee," he said. "Black, and—" He looked at the girl. "Sophie, do you want something to eat?" Sophie, the name suited her somehow, set down the menu and nodded. "Blueberry muffin." "We have those," Claire confirmed. She looked at the man. "For you?" He shook his head slightly. "Just the coffee." "You sure? The muffins are pretty good, baked this morning." He looked at her then. Actually looked at her, not through her. He had dark eyes. Not dramatically dark, just the kind of deep brown that doesn't reflect much light. And something about them made her feel briefly like she'd said something that caught him off guard. "Just the coffee," he said again. Quieter this time. Like he meant it differently than the first time. "Coming right up." She brought their order over about 8 minutes later. Sophie wrapped both hands around the mug immediately and inhaled the steam with her eyes closed, which was objectively the correct way to receive hot chocolate. "This smells like Christmas," Sophie announced. "That's the cinnamon," Claire said. "We add a little on top." "My mom used to put cinnamon on things," Sophie said, in the easy, unguarded way children say things that level adults. The silence that followed was brief but had weight. The man, he hadn't given his name, Claire hadn't asked, was looking at the table. Something shifted in his face, very slightly, like a door closing without a sound. "That's a really nice thing to remember," Claire said. She kept her voice even, matter of fact. She'd learned over years of this work that sometimes the kindest thing you could do was not make someone feel like they'd just dropped something fragile in public. Sophie nodded and bit into her muffin. The man picked up his coffee and drank it without looking up again. The cafe got busy again around 10. Claire moved through tables, refilling cups, running plates, fielding the small complaints and smaller conversations that made up the texture of a morning shift. She checked on the window table twice more, once to bring Sophie a napkin, once to refill the man's coffee, and both times she noticed he'd barely moved. He was watching Sophie draw something on the paper placemat with a crayon she'd apparently produced from her coat pocket. He watched her the way you watch something you're afraid might disappear. It was just before the kitchen was about to flip to the lunch prep that he brought his check to the register. Sophie was holding his hand again, her placemat folded carefully and tucked under her other arm like a document. He set his card on the counter. Claire ran it. The machine beeped. She glanced at the screen, declined. She looked up. He was already looking at her. For a second, neither of them said anything. Behind him, 2 people had joined the line. Sophie was looking at a display of local honey jars near the door and didn't notice. Claire had watched this happen to people before. The small collapse of dignity that came with a declined card, the way people's faces rearranged themselves, the mix of embarrassment and defensiveness, and the desperate mental arithmetic of what went wrong. What do I fix? How do I get out of this? She'd watched it make people mean. She'd watched it make people disappear into themselves. She'd watched people snap at cashiers, and she'd watched people apologize so excessively it was painful. This man did none of those things. He just went very still. "My apologies," he said quietly. "I'm not... There must be an issue with the account. I can..." He reached into his jacket pocket, searching. It's fine, Claire said. She said it before she'd fully decided to, which was how she made most of her better decisions. I've got it. He looked up. The same look as before, caught off guard, like she'd said something in a language he didn't expect to hear. That's not, he started. $12.50, Claire said, punching it through herself. She pulled the $11 from the tip section of her apron and the remaining $1.50 from her own pocket without making it into anything. She kept her voice light, businesslike. Sophie's hot chocolate was worth every cent. She had the right reaction to it. He stared at her for a moment that lasted slightly too long. I'll pay you back, he said. You don't need to. I want to. It's $12.50, Claire said, almost gently. Please don't lose sleep over it. He didn't smile, but something in his expression shifted, a small, involuntary thing, like a muscle releasing that he'd been holding tense for a long time without knowing it. Thank you, he said. The words came out like they cost something. Come back any time, Claire said. She looked past him to Sophie, who had turned around and was watching the exchange with large, curious eyes. That goes double for the hot chocolate expert. Sophie grinned. One of her front teeth was slightly crooked. It was the most unselfconscious, uncomplicated smile Claire had seen in weeks. They left. The door swung shut behind them. The line moved forward. Claire went back to work. She didn't think about it much for the rest of the shift. That wasn't coldness. It wasn't indifference. It was just that a thing had happened, a small human thing, and she'd responded to it the way it seemed to require. And now the morning continued. The world didn't pause for small kindnesses. It barely noticed them. That was fine. That wasn't why you did them. She counted her tips at the end of the shift. $43 and change, which was a decent Monday. She set aside $20 for Marcus's prescription refill, tucked the rest in the envelope she kept in her dresser for the ever-present threat of next month's rent, and made herself a bowl of pasta for dinner because she'd been meaning to go to the grocery store for 3 days and still hadn't. Her apartment was small. That was the word she used. Small, not cramped, not run down, not the longer and more accurate list of descriptors that applied. One bedroom that she'd turned into a studio/storage space, a living room that served as her bedroom, a kitchen that was technically functional. The walls had more paintings on them than a space this size could really support, most of them hers, some of them done by students at the community center that she'd asked to keep rather than admit she was collecting them. The whole place smelled like oil paint and something vaguely herbal from the candles she burned when she needed to feel like she lived somewhere intentional. She liked it. Some nights she liked it a lot. Other nights she sat on the edge of her couch bed and did the math on everything she owed, everything she needed, the distance between where she was at 30 and where she'd believed at 22 she would be by now, and the math was unkind. Tonight she didn't do the math. She ate her pasta and watched half of a documentary about migratory birds and fell asleep with the lamp still on, which was a habit she'd had since she was a kid and had never fully broken. Marcus called the next morning at 7. Her brother was 24, 6 years younger, and lived 40 minutes away in Murfreesboro in a 2-bedroom with a roommate Claire had never met, but had formed strong opinions about based on context clues. Marcus was funny and scattered and deeply kind in the way of people who've had to earn it, and he'd been managing his anxiety disorder long enough that he was mostly steady now, but mostly had an asterisk that cost money to maintain. Hey, he said. You up? Obviously. I open at 6. Right. A pause. Did you cover my prescription again? Claire hesitated for half a second too long, and he caught it. Claire. It's fine, Marcus. I told you not to. I had it. I just needed to wait for the deposit. I know, it's fine. You can pay me back whenever. You don't have it to spare right now. Neither do you, she said, and you need the medication more than I need the $12. Silence on his end. Then, it was $23. Marcus, I'm going to pay you back. I know you are. Can we talk about something else? He was quiet for a moment. She could hear him breathing, the way you can when someone is trying to figure out how to say a thing. I got an interview, he said, at that place downtown, the print shop. Marcus. This time she meant it differently. That's great. That's genuinely great. It's just an interview. It's an interview. That's a start. She pushed her voice up a notch. You're going to do great. You always say that. I always mean it. You're likable, and you're good with your hands, and you show up on time. That's 70% of most jobs. He laughed. Short, reluctant, but real. What's the other 30? Not burning the place down. Manageable. Very manageable. She could hear him smiling. It did something to her chest, that sound. She'd spent a significant portion of her 20s being scared for him in one form or another, and she wasn't entirely past that fear yet. But moments like this, the laughing, the ordinary morning call, the interview at the print shop, she held them differently now, not taking them for granted. Not exactly. After she hung up, she sat for a minute before getting ready. $11 left in her account. Rent in 3 days. A box of pasta in the cabinet and half a loaf of bread. A job she was good at, a brother who was trying, a collection of paintings on walls that were hers. She got up and put on her jacket, the one with the broken zipper, and went to work. He came back the next morning. That surprised her. Not in a dramatic way. She just hadn't expected it. People pass through Magnolia Morning all the time, tourists and regulars, and the broad middle category of people who came once or twice and then disappeared back into the city. She'd assumed the man and his daughter were in that middle category, but there he was. Same table by the window. Sophie already in her seat, both pigtails slightly more even this time, working on a new drawing on a fresh placemat. Claire brought the coffee and hot chocolate without being asked. He looked up when she set them down. I didn't order yet. I know, but I figured. She nodded at Sophie's drawing. What are you working on? Sophie looked up from her art with complete seriousness. A horse. But I'm not sure I'm doing the legs right. Horses are notoriously hard, Claire said. The legs are always the problem. Do you know how to draw horses? I can try. I'm an art teacher. Sophie's eyes went wide. You can teach art. Part-time. Claire glanced at the man. He was watching her again with that careful, contained expression. I'm here most mornings, though. If your dad keeps bringing you in, maybe I can show you the trick with the legs. Daddy. Sophie looked at him with the full urgency of a 6-year-old who has made a decision. We have to keep coming here. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. Close to one. The closest she'd seen. Apparently, he said. He looked at Claire. I'm Adrian. He said it simply, without the weight of a last name, which Claire didn't notice as unusual. People introduced themselves first name only all the time. Claire, she said. The coffee's on the house this morning, by the way. Apology for charging you yesterday when your card was having a moment. It wasn't your I know, but still. She pulled out her order pad. Muffin this time? A pause. Yeah, he said. Sure. It was such a small word. Sure. But he said it like it surprised him. Like agreeing to something easy was a thing he'd forgotten he was allowed to do. He came back Wednesday. Then Thursday. Then the following Monday with Sophie's backpack slung over his shoulder, and they stayed for almost 2 hours while Sophie showed Claire her horse drawings, and Claire showed her how to build the leg from the hip joint down, rather than guessing at the shape. They talked the way strangers learn to talk, in short exchanges around the work of other things. Claire showed Sophie how to mix colors. Adrian sat nearby with his coffee going cold, watching, offering the occasional quiet correction when Sophie got frustrated. It doesn't have to look exactly right, bug. And sometimes just being still in the way that some people are simply comfortable with silence. Claire noticed things about him the way she noticed things about people who sat in her section long enough. He held his coffee mug with both hands, the way someone does when they want something to hold on to. He checked his phone infrequently, and when he did, his jaw tightened slightly before he put it away. He laughed, rarely, quietly, at things Sophie said, and when he did, it looked like it caught him off guard every time, like he hadn't been expecting to find something funny. He asked questions about her art classes, careful, specific questions, not the polite kind that are really just conversation maintenance. Oh, that sounds nice, what's that like? But the kind that meant he'd been listening the last time she talked about it and had followed the thread. You said the community center changed the schedule, he said one Thursday. Did that end up working out? She paused. She'd mentioned that maybe 3 weeks ago, in passing, while Sophie was occupied with a purple mountain landscape of questionable geological accuracy. Yeah, she said. Mostly. I lost the Friday session, which was the one with the oldest kids. They were the most fun to teach, honestly. Teenagers who actually want to be there instead of being dropped off. Why'd they cut it? Budget stuff. It's always budget stuff. He nodded, looked at Sophie. Then, do you like teaching? Or is it... Is it just the job that made sense? The question was direct enough that it caught her off guard. Most people didn't ask the follow-up. They asked, "Do you like it?" and took yes as a complete answer. Both, she said. It was available and I can pay rent from it, but I'd do it even if it paid less. She paused. There's something about watching a kid figure out that they made the thing, like they made the mark, and the mark is real, and it's theirs. Most kids don't get enough of that. Enough times of being told you made something and it matters. He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. They don't. I was still looking at Sophie. The little girl had her tongue between her teeth, concentrating on a cloud she was shading with the side of her crayon. She was completely absorbed, completely safe, completely in her own world. Claire looked at Adrian, and she thought, whatever loss is sitting on you, you carry it very quietly. She didn't say that. She went to refill the coffee. The thing about learning someone incrementally is that you don't notice the accumulation until you're already in the middle of something. It was a Wednesday, about 6 weeks after the first morning, when Claire realized she'd started looking forward to them coming in. Not in a dramatic heart-skipping way. Not yet. More like the way you look forward to the sun being out, or the bus running on time, or any small reliable thing in a life that had a lot of unreliable variables. Sophie had started bringing her sketchbook. She'd filled half of it with horses in various states of anatomical improvement, and she'd started branching out, trees, birds, what she described as a volcano but friendly. She would arrive and immediately set up like she was settling in for serious work, pulling out her pencils and arranging them in order of darkness with the focus of a professional. Adrian watched this setup ritual every time with the same expression. Claire had started to be able to read that expression a little. It was love, obviously, parental love, the fierce and exhausted and unqualified kind. But it was also something sharper, grief and love mixed together, which in her experience was one of the harder combinations to carry. She'd started to put the pieces together without asking. The two big boots, bought ahead of growth. The pigtails that were getting more even week over week. A father practicing. The way Adrian redirected Sophie's questions about mommy not with silence or deflection, but with mommy loved purple too, or mommy would have wanted to see this one, present in absence, woven in rather than blocked out. It was careful and deliberate, and it spoke to a man who'd thought hard about how to do an impossible thing. She didn't ask about the wife. It wasn't her place. But she stopped being a stranger to him that week in the quiet interior way that happened between people before either of them named it. The first time they went somewhere outside the cafe was an accident. Claire's shift ended at 2. She was outside pulling on her jacket, the one with the broken zipper, wrestling it shut in the wind, when she nearly walked into Adrian and Sophie coming around the corner. Sophie was eating a soft pretzel from the stand down the block and had gotten mustard on her chin without apparently being aware of it. Mustard, Claire told her, pointing to her own chin. Sophie wiped at it with the back of her hand. This distributed it more thoroughly across her face. Claire tried not to smile and failed. We were going to the river, Sophie announced. She was already looking at Claire the way children look at people they've decided to include. Do you want to come? Sophs, Adrian started. I was walking that direction anyway, Claire said. This was approximately 40% true. She looked at Adrian. If that's okay. He looked at her. Something in his expression did the thing it sometimes did. The small, involuntary shift. It's okay, he said. They walked. The three of them along 2nd Avenue, Sophie between them, narrating a detailed comparison of every dog they passed. The Cumberland River was gray-green that afternoon, catching light at the surface in a way that made Claire wish she'd brought her sketchbook. The pedestrian bridge was mostly empty. Sophie ran ahead and stopped at the railing and looked down at the water with the kind of full-body awe that made Claire remember being 6. She and Adrian walked slower behind, not talking much, not needing to, which was its own thing. She's going to be okay, Claire said. She hadn't planned to say it. She still didn't entirely know where it came from. Adrian was quiet for a moment. She seems like it, doesn't she? She's more than seems. She's actually okay. She laughs like someone who believes things will generally work out. Claire paused. Kids who've been through a lot either break toward fear or toward openness. She's going toward openness. That doesn't happen by accident. He didn't answer right away. They walked another 20 steps. Her mother died 14 months ago, he said. His voice was flat in the way that meant controlled, not unfeeling. Aneurysm. She was here one day and then she wasn't, Sophie was 4. I've been trying to figure out since then how to do this in a way that doesn't. He stopped. Doesn't damage her, Claire said. Yeah. You're not damaging her. He glanced at her sideways. You can't know that. I know kids, Claire said. Occupational habit. I've seen what damage looks like when it's in the process. That's not what's happening with Sophie. She kept her voice steady, factual. You're doing better than you think. He looked away. At the river, at his daughter, who had found a leaf and was studying it with academic intensity. I don't know what I'm doing half the time, he said quietly, like a confession to the air rather than to her. Nobody does, Claire said. The people who seem sure are usually just louder about being wrong. That got a short, surprised sound out of him that might have been a laugh. Small and brief, but real. Sophie appeared between them suddenly, holding up the leaf. It's shaped like a hand, she declared. It really is, Claire said. Can you draw a hand? I can teach you to draw a hand. Sophie looked at her father. See, she said with complete satisfaction. They got takeout on the way back. Nothing planned. Sophie spotted a Thai place on a corner and looked at her father with her whole face, the way she apparently did when she wanted something and was giving him the opportunity to offer it without her having to ask. It was a technique of startling effectiveness. They sat on a bench near the Bicentennial Park with containers of pad thai and spring rolls and ate while Sophie asked Claire what she did when she was little, and Claire told her, mostly honestly, about growing up in Clarksville with a single mother and a little brother. And not much money, but enough colored pencils to cover every surface of the house in drawings. Where's your mom now? Sophie asked. She passed away a few years ago. Heart trouble. That's sad. It is, Claire said, but I think about her a lot. Good things. Sophie nodded, chewing her spring roll. I think about my mommy too, she said. Daddy says that's good. Daddy says it means she's still with us. Claire glanced at Adrian. He was looking at his food. Your daddy's right, she said. He's usually right, Sophie said, with the magnanimous certainty of someone granting a compliment. Except about vegetables. I'm right about vegetables, Adrian said. Broccoli, Sophie said, as if that was the entirety of the counter-argument. Broccoli is nutritionally significant, Adrian said, with the exhausted cadence of a man who has lost this specific debate many times. Claire laughed. An actual laugh. Not a polite one. It came out before she could calibrate it. Both of them looked at her. Sorry, she said. Not sorry. Don't apologize, Adrian said. And then he smiled. A real one, finally, crooked and small and unused looking, like something that had been stored somewhere and was surprised to find itself out in the air. It changed his face entirely. Made him look younger. Made him look, for just a second, like someone who wasn't carrying so much. Claire looked away at the park. Somewhere down in her chest, something she hadn't been paying attention to rearranged itself quietly. She walked home alone that evening and stood in her apartment and looked at the painting on the wall directly opposite the couch. She'd done it 2 years ago, a figure, loosely rendered, sitting at a table with a coffee cup in front of them. She'd meant it to be about solitude at the time, about the feeling of being alone in a public place and finding it, unexpectedly, bearable. She looked at it for a long time. Then she went to her drawing table and pulled out her sketchbook and drew from memory, a man at a window table, looking at his daughter, with that expression she'd been trying to name for 6 weeks. She titled it, in her own head, The Stranger. She kept it to herself. She didn't know yet what she was keeping it for. Well, it was the last week of November when Marcus's prescription ran out again, and her car made a sound on the way to the community center that cost $400 she didn't have. And the school where she'd been hoping to pick up a substitute teaching certification course raised its enrollment fee by $80. And Claire sat in her car outside the cafe on a Tuesday night after closing the Tuesday evening shift and did the math. And the math was, as the math tended to be, unkind. She was not a person who cried about money. She'd trained herself out of it when she was 23, and the training had mostly held. But she sat in the car for 20 minutes with the heater running and her forehead against the steering wheel and let herself feel the specific exhaustion of being someone who worked hard and did everything right and still came up short in the same ways, month after month, with no endpoint visible on any horizon. She was 30 years old. She was tired. Then she drove home. She made tea. She laid out her watercolors and painted a small horse, the way Sophie was learning to do, from the hip joint down. It turned out okay. She went to sleep. The next morning, she opened the cafe. At 9:23, the door opened and Adrian came in with Sophie, who was wearing a new coat, red again, this one with all its buttons, and who waved at Claire from across the room like she was flagging down a ship. Claire waved back. She picked up the coffee pot and went to take their order. Some mornings that was enough. That morning, it was. December arrived in Nashville the way it always did. Without asking, without apology, dropping temperatures overnight and stringing lights along every storefront on Broadway, until the whole city looked like it was trying to convince itself that everything was fine, actually, and wasn't the world beautiful if you squinted at it right. Claire had always had a complicated relationship with December. The lights were genuinely nice. The music was tolerable in small doses. The cold she could handle. But December had a way of making the gap between what your life was and what you'd imagined it might be feel wider than it did in, say, September. Something about all that enforced cheerfulness made the honest parts of things more visible by contrast. She bought a small pine branch from a guy selling them outside the hardware store and put it in a mason jar on her windowsill. That was the extent of her decorating. It smelled good. It was enough. What wasn't enough, and what she was actively trying not to fixate on, was that the community center had sent a letter, an actual paper letter, which meant they'd been thinking about this long enough to print something, informing her that the spring semester schedule was being restructured, and her Thursday afternoon session was under review pending budget approval. Under review was administrative language for probably gone, and she knew it. She didn't tell Marcus. He'd worry, and his interview at the print shop had gone well enough that they were calling him back for a second one, and she didn't want to muddy that with her problems. She didn't tell Deb either, though Deb had a way of reading her that made full concealment basically impossible. "You're clenching your jaw again," Deb said on a Tuesday, not looking up from the schedule she was rewriting. "I always clench my jaw." "You clench it differently when you're doing math in your head." Claire didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. "Whatever it is," Deb said, "it's survivable. Everything so far has been survivable." "That's a fairly low bar." "It's a consistent one." Deb finally looked up. "You taking any time off over the holidays?" "I'll work Christmas Eve. The tips are good." Deb studied her for a moment with the particular look she reserved for things she'd decided not to push. "Fine," she said. "But you're taking Christmas Day." "Deb, non-negotiable. The cafe is closed Christmas Day. I don't want to see your face here." She went back to the schedule. "Go be with your brother." Claire opened her mouth to object and decided against it. There were battles worth having and battles that were just noise, and she'd gotten better at telling the difference, mostly. She went out to the floor and did her job and tried not to think about the letter. Adrian came in at 9:40, which was later than his usual time. Sophie was in school that day. She'd started going Tuesdays and Thursdays to a small private school that Claire had no context for and hadn't asked about. So he was alone, which was a rarity. He looked different without his daughter beside him. Not lesser, exactly. Just unanchored in a small, specific way, the way parents sometimes look when the kid isn't there to organize around. He sat at the window table out of what was clearly habit. Claire brought him his coffee without asking. "No Sophie today?" she said. "School." He wrapped both hands around the mug. "She informed me this morning that her class is learning about the water cycle, and she already knows how clouds work, so it's going to be a little boring," her words. "She's not wrong about clouds. She's definitely not." He drank his coffee. "She's been talking about you." Claire paused in the act of straightening the napkin dispenser. "About me?" "About art. She's been talking about art, which means she's been talking about you, because apparently I don't understand art, and you do." He said it without any edge, descriptive rather than critical. "She told me last week that you showed her how shadows work. She spent 40 minutes shadowing everything in the kitchen, the fruit bowl, the toaster, her cereal box. The cereal box is a great subject, lots of flat planes. I'll tell her that. She'll be very vindicated." A pause. "She asked me if you were going to be here forever." Something about the way he said it, careful, almost neutral, made Claire feel like that sentence had more weight than its surface. She kept her voice easy. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I didn't know." He looked up at her. She was unsatisfied with that answer. "Kids usually are," Claire said. He nodded, looked at his coffee. Something was sitting with him. She could feel it the way you feel weather coming, a pressure change in the air. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Sure." "The art teaching, is that—" He stopped, chose different words. "If money wasn't the consideration, Would you still be waitressing here, or would you be doing something else? The question sat between them. It wasn't unkind, but it was direct in a way she hadn't fully expected. Both, she said. I'd still want to be somewhere like this. I like people in the morning. I like the rhythm of it. She leaned against the counter slightly. But if money wasn't the thing I was solving for every month, I'd have more time for the teaching. More sessions, maybe a real studio space. I'd take on kids who can't pay. She paused. I think about that sometimes. What I'd do with a room and some supplies and no financial pressure attached to it. I was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that careful attention she'd stopped being unnerved by. That's specific, he said. I've thought about it a lot. It sounds like something worth doing. She smiled, a little ruefully. Most things that are worth doing cost money. He didn't answer that. He drank his coffee and looked out the window at the street, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind that had taken 6 weeks to build. When he left a $50 tip on a $7 coffee, which he'd done twice before. Claire had given it back the first time. The second time she'd held it for a moment and then put it in the register toward someone else's check. This time she stood there and looked at it and thought about the community center letter and Marcus's prescription and put it, quietly, in her apron. She thought about the question he'd asked. Would you still be waitressing here, or would you be doing something else? She thought about it more than she expected to for the rest of the week. December moved forward. The pine branch on her windowsill started to dry out and drop needles onto the sill like small brown messages. She swept them up every few days and added a little water to the mason jar and told herself it was still mostly alive. The Thursday session got cut. The letter came. Another paper letter, which she was starting to think was the community center's way of delivering bad news at a physical remove. And it was polite and regretful and full of language about funding cycles and organizational priorities, and it meant that starting January she was down one session, which was down $60 a week, which was down $240 a month, which was a number that landed heavily in her chest and stayed there. She put the letter in the kitchen drawer where she kept things she wasn't ready to deal with yet, made herself a cup of tea, and painted for an hour. She painted the river the way it had looked the afternoon the three of them walked along it, the gray-green surface, the light breaking at odd angles. She'd been painting from memory a lot lately. She hadn't fully examined why. Adrian came in the next Monday and she didn't mention the letter. He asked about her weekend and she told him she'd spent Sunday repainting a cabinet in her kitchen, which was true, and that Marcus had gotten the print shop job, which she'd found out Saturday morning, and which was genuinely the best thing that had happened in a while. He started Thursday, she said. He texted me at noon on his first day to tell me his coworker brought donuts and he'd eaten 3. That's a strong first impression. That's Marcus. Adrian smiled, the small, surprised-looking smile. She'd started looking for it without meaning to. The way you start looking for something specific on the horizon once you know what it looks like. That's good, he said. That he has the job. It really is. She sat down across from him. Not something she'd normally do on a shift, but the cafe was in its mid-morning quiet spell, and Deb was in the back and nobody needed anything. He's been trying hard. Sometimes you just need something to go right once, so you can believe things can go right again. Yeah, Adrian said. He was looking at the table. Yeah, that's... He stopped. Then, it took me a long time to understand that. That one thing going right doesn't fix everything, but it changes the angle somehow. What changed your angle? He looked up. The question had come out more directly than she'd intended, and for a second she thought he was going to redirect, change the subject, make a joke, do the thing people do when they don't want to answer. But he didn't. Sophie Chet, he said. After her mother died, I was not functioning in any way that looked like functioning. I was going through motions in a very convincing way. And then Sophie did something. She was probably 4.5. She climbed into my lap while I was sitting in the kitchen not doing anything, and she put her hand on my face and said, "Daddy, you look tired. Do you want me to sing to you?" And she sang me this song, just completely made up, no real words to it, just sounds she'd invented. He paused. It didn't fix anything, but the angle changed. But Claire didn't say anything for a moment. There was nothing to say that wouldn't diminish it. She sounds like a really remarkable kid, she said finally. She is. His voice was quiet. She's the best thing I've ever... Yeah. He stopped himself. Looked slightly embarrassed at what he'd been about to say. Sorry, I don't usually... Don't apologize, Claire said. She echoed his own words back to him from that evening at the park, and he caught it. She saw him catch it, the slight recognition. Table 4 needs their check, Deb called from near the kitchen. Claire stood, saved by the bell. For me or for you? Adrian said. Debatable, she said, and went to take care of table 4, and she could feel him watching her go without turning around to check, and she was pretty sure she wasn't wrong about that. The thing was, and she admitted this to herself in small increments, the way you confess things to yourself when you're not ready to call them what they are. The thing was that she'd started thinking about him outside of the cafe context. Not in a consuming way, not in a way that interfered with anything. Just the ordinary, quiet accumulation of someone becoming a presence in your life in a way they hadn't been before. She thought about him when she was painting, mostly. That happened first. She'd catch herself wondering what he'd think of something she was working on, or what Sophie would name the color she was mixing. She thought about him when she walked past the river, when she passed a bookstore and thought about going in the way the three of them had the previous month, when Sophie had spent 20 minutes examining every book in the children's section with curatorial seriousness, and Adrian had picked up a novel from a display table and read the first page standing up, and Claire had watched him and thought about what it would mean to know someone well enough to know what they read. She was not naive about what this was. She was 30 years old. She recognized the feeling. She just wasn't doing anything about it, because doing something about it required a certainty she didn't have, and a stability she wasn't sure she could claim. And anyway, he came to the cafe with his daughter and drank his coffee, and sometimes they talked in the easy way of people who'd stumbled into something comfortable, and maybe that was all it was, and maybe that was all she needed it to be. She held it carefully, the way you hold something you're not sure how to carry yet. The second Saturday of December, Sophie came in wearing a paper crown she'd made at school and immediately informed Claire that she'd been voted most creative by her class. The crown had blue glitter on it and was slightly askew. She was enormously pleased with herself. That's an official title now, Claire told her. Most creative. It goes on your resume. What's a resume? A list of your best things, for when you're older and you want people to know why they should trust you. Sophie considered this. Can I put best horse drawings on it? Absolutely. You should lead with that. They sat together at the window table for most of the morning. Sophie had brought a new set of colored pencils, a big set, the kind with more shades than any kid actually needs, which was exactly the right kind. And Claire showed her how to do basic perspective. How to make something look like it's going away from you. How to make space exist on a flat surface just by changing where lines aimed. Sophie got it faster than most adults did. She had a feel for it, an intuitive spatial sense that Claire recognized immediately as something real and innate and worth developing properly. You have a good eye, Claire told her. Sophie looked at her drawing and then at Claire with complete seriousness. You have a good eye too, she said. Do you think it's because we're both artists? I think that might be exactly it, Claire said. Adrian, across the table with his coffee, made a small sound that was definitely a laugh he'd tried unsuccessfully to suppress. Claire glanced at him. He shook his head slightly, still smiling, looking at his daughter. What? Sophie demanded. Nothing, Adrian said. You're right. That's definitely exactly it. Sophie returned to her drawing, satisfied. Adrian looked at Claire. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything. The moment lasted maybe 3 seconds and contained something neither of them named. Deb saw it. Of course Deb saw it. She said nothing at the time, but when Claire was closing out her register at the end of the shift, Deb appeared beside her and pretended to be reviewing something on the schedule. How long has he been coming in? Deb said. Who? Deb gave her a look. 7 weeks, roughly, Claire said. And you've been outside the cafe with them. We walked to the river once. We got Thai food. Deb flipped a page on her clipboard. It's not, Claire started. I didn't say anything. You were about to. I was going to say, Deb said, that you're the worst liar I've ever employed, and I've employed some remarkable liars. She paused. He looks at you like you're a fact he's still trying to verify. Claire didn't answer. That's not a bad thing, Deb said, and walked away. Claire stood there for a moment and thought about the word verify. She thought about what it meant to look at someone that way. To hold something at arm's length, not because you didn't want it, but because you'd been wrong before, and the cost of being wrong again was a number you couldn't afford. She thought she understood that better than she could have explained. The week before Christmas, he came in alone again. He seemed tired in a way that was different from his usual tired, less the quiet exhaustion of someone carrying grief, more the specific worn-down look of someone who'd been dealing with things that required performance. He sat down and she brought the coffee, and he looked at the mug for a moment before speaking. "I have to go to New York next week," he said. "A few days. Sophie's going to stay with her grandmother." "That's good. Sophie will like that." "She will." He drank his coffee. "I don't love leaving." "She'll be fine. She's got your angle, remember?" He looked up. The line from their previous conversation, remembered and returned. Something moved in his expression. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, she does." She refilled his coffee and they talked for a while. About nothing in particular, about Marcus's first paycheck and the book Sophie was reading and whether Nashville was better or worse in December, which was a genuinely contested question. There was something different about him today. Not uncomfortable, exactly. More like someone standing on the edge of something they're deciding whether to step off. He left without saying whatever it was. She noticed. She filed it away and let it be. He called the cafe the day after Christmas. She knew it was him before she answered somehow, which was not logical, but was also not wrong. "I'm back," he said when she picked up. "From New York." "How was it?" "Productive. Long." A pause. "I missed." He stopped. "I'll be in tomorrow, if you're working." "I'm working." "Good." He hung up. Claire stood holding the receiver of the old landline Deb refused to replace because she distrusted cell phones for business purposes. And she stood there with the phone in her hand for a moment, and she thought, oh, just that. Oh, the way you realize something you've been arriving at for weeks. He came in the next morning at 9:15. Sophie was with him, back from her grandmother's and full of stories about the 3 days she'd spent being spoiled by an older woman who apparently let her eat dessert before dinner, which she reported with the energy of someone describing a historical event. Every night, Sophie said, spreading her hands wide. Even the night it was raining, even the night there was a storm. "Dessert before dinner is its own weather system," Claire said. Sophie thought about this. "Yes," she decided. "Yes, that's right." Adrian sat across from his daughter looking slightly more rested than he had before he left, but watching her with that particular focus again, the memorizing look, like he'd spent 3 days away and needed to relearn her dimensions. He looked up and found Claire watching him. Neither of them looked away immediately. That was new. "Daddy," Sophie said, without looking up from the placemat she was already drawing on. "Your coffee's getting cold." "Is it?" Adrian said, still looking at Claire. "I can feel you not drinking it." He picked up his coffee. Claire went to check on another table. When she came back to refill his cup, he said very quietly, so only she could hear, "I want to take you somewhere. Not the river. Somewhere different." She paused with the coffee pot in her hand. "Where?" "Old bookstore on 5th. There's a back room with local art. I thought you'd have opinions." She should have said something like, "I'll think about it," or maybe when my schedule clears up, the kind of hedging language that buys time. She didn't. "Saturday?" she said. "Saturday," he said. Sophie was still drawing, completely absorbed. The lines she was putting down were confident, purposeful, the eye coming through. Claire went back to work. She spent the rest of the shift in a state of ordinary competence that concealed, underneath, something that felt like standing in the sun after a long time in the shade. Not dramatic, just warm, just the slow return of something familiar. She still didn't know his last name. It hadn't come up. She hadn't asked. That detail would matter later in a way she hadn't even begun to imagine. But on that Thursday morning in late December, with Christmas lights still up in the windows and Sophie's colored pencils spread across the table like a small declaration of intent, Claire Bennett didn't know that. She knew only what was in front of her. A man who remembered what she said, a child who made her laugh, and a Saturday she was already, quietly, looking forward to. She refilled the coffee of the man at table 3 who always read the physical newspaper even though it was expensive and impractical, and she smiled at the older woman near the door who came in every Wednesday and ordered chamomile tea and sat alone and was, Claire had always suspected, simply glad of somewhere to be. And the cafe hummed around her with its usual warmth. Some things you can't see coming. Some things you can feel arriving, incrementally, the way cold feels like it's settling in before the temperature actually drops. The way you know a storm is coming by the quality of the air before the first cloud appears. Claire felt it. She didn't name it, but it was there, present and warm and slightly terrifying, like standing in a room with a window she'd been afraid to open and feeling, for the first time, like she might actually want to see what was outside. She folded her order pad into her apron and topped off the coffee at table 6 and moved through the morning with the careful competence of someone doing a job they knew by heart, carrying something new and unnamed and not altogether unwelcome in the space behind her ribs. Outside, December was doing its level best against the windows. Inside, the cafe was warm and smelled like roasted beans and the suggestion of cinnamon, and at the table by the window, a small girl in a red coat was drawing something she was proud of, and her father was watching her, and Claire was doing her job, and for right now, that was the whole world. That was enough. The bookstore was called Harlow and Sons, which was misleading because there hadn't been a Harlow involved in its operation for at least 30 years, and the current owner was a woman named Pat, who was 73, wore paint-stained overalls every day regardless of weather, and had an opinion about every book on every shelf that she would share with you whether you asked or not. Claire had been inside twice before, both times briefly. It was the kind of place that required time to do properly. Narrow aisles, books stacked horizontally on top of other books, handwritten index cards tacked to shelves, identifying sections with descriptions like things that will ruin you in the best way in history, but the parts they skip. The back room Adrian had mentioned was past the Tennessee authors section and down 2 steps, and it was exactly what he'd described. Local art, maybe 30 pieces, hung close together on exposed brick walls, the way someone had arranged them, who cared more about the work than about aesthetics. Claire stood in front of a large charcoal piece, a Nashville street scene, the old arcade building, done in a style that was technically accomplished but emotionally flat, the kind of work that demonstrated skill without revealing the person behind it, and felt, for the first time in weeks, the professional part of her brain fully engaged. "The technique is there," she said, without looking at Adrian, "but they don't believe in the subject. You can see it. When someone believes in what they're drawing, the line weight changes. This is even throughout. Everything equally important, which means nothing actually is." "How do you see that?" "Same way you can hear when someone's reading a speech versus actually saying something." She moved to the next piece. This one was smaller, a watercolor of a woman at a window, loose and warm, the figure slightly blurred at the edges the way memory blurs things. "This one's the opposite. The technique is rougher, but she means it. You can tell it's someone specific." Adrian was standing close enough that she was aware of him in her peripheral vision. He was looking at the painting, not at her. "Do you have work like this somewhere?" he asked. "In a show, or—" "I had 3 pieces in a group show at a gallery on Charlotte Avenue last spring. Small thing. Mostly local artists." She shrugged. "It was good. I sold 1 piece." The woman who bought it cried a little, which is either the best or the most alarming thing that can happen when someone looks at your work. "Which did it feel like?" "Both. Mostly best." She looked at the watercolor woman at the window. "I don't submit much anymore. There's a time cost to it. Applications, framing, the back and forth. I keep meaning to." "You should," he said. Simple and direct, not a flattery. "I've seen your sketchbook." She looked at him then. "When did you see my sketchbook?" "You left it on the table 2 weeks ago when you went to check on the kitchen." Sophie looked at it before I could stop her. A slight apologetic tilt of his head. "She showed me the river painting, the one from when we walked." Claire didn't say anything for a moment. That painting was in there. She'd painted it from memory, and it had come out more intimate than she'd planned, and she'd kept it in the sketchbook rather than transferring it to proper paper because she wasn't sure what to do with it. "She said it looked like a real place," Adrian said. "She said she could tell because it looked a little cold." Kids are better critics than most adults. She's not wrong about the cold. You can feel it looking at it. He paused. "You captured something about that afternoon." The back room was quiet around them. Pat was somewhere in the front of the store, audibly explaining to a customer why they actually wanted the collected letters rather than the biography. Cold January light came through a single small window above the art display. "It was a good afternoon," Claire said. "It was," Adrian said. And then, without making it into anything, without building toward it, "They've mostly all been good, the afternoons." She looked at him. He was looking at the watercolor, his hands in his jacket pockets, his jaw with its perpetual few days of stubble, his eyes doing that thing where they were somewhere between this room and somewhere else entirely. "Adrian," she said. He looked at her. She didn't have a sentence prepared. She'd started with his name and hadn't planned beyond it. They stood there in the back room of Harlow and Sons on a Saturday in January, and something hung between them that had been building since November and was now requiring acknowledgement in some form. "I don't know what this is," she said, honest, if not elegant. "I don't mean that as a problem. I just mean I don't know how to categorize it, and I've stopped trying, and I wanted to say that out loud to someone other than myself." He looked at her for a long moment. "I know what it is," he said. Her chest did something complicated. "I just don't know what to do with it," he added, quieter. The thing that lived underneath all his careful steadiness, showing through briefly, like light through a crack. "I haven't—" He stopped, tried again. "It's been a long time since I wanted to do something with it. With anything." "I know," she said, because she did know. She'd watched him long enough. "I don't want to do this wrong," he said. "Nobody wants that. I have a daughter who's attached to you. I have a life that's—" He paused on that word with something she couldn't read. "Complicated. And you deserve someone who can offer you—" "Don't," Claire said. He stopped. "Don't decide what I deserve on my behalf," she said. Not unkindly, but firmly. "I'm 30 years old. I know how to evaluate risk." He absorbed that. Something shifted in his expression, the release of a tension he'd been holding. "Okay," he said. "Okay? Okay." He almost smiled. "You're right. I'm sorry. Don't apologize either. Just don't do that thing where you decide it's better for me to be protected from something I'm choosing." Noted. They stood there another moment. "So what do we do?" he said. "I have no idea," Claire said. "Let's go get coffee somewhere that isn't my workplace and see what happens." That did get a laugh. A real one, short and surprised. "Fair enough," he said. They found a place 2 streets over that made decent espresso and sat across from each other at a small table and talked for 2 hours in the way you talk when you're not performing for anyone, when the pretense of being casual about something has been quietly set aside. They talked about Sophie and about Marcus and about Nashville and about whether you could love a city and find it exhausting in equal measure and about the difference between the life you'd planned and the one you'd ended up inside. He told her that his wife's name had been Nora, that she'd been a landscape architect, that she'd had a laugh that was embarrassingly loud in restaurants, and had been completely unashamed of it, which was one of the things he'd loved most. He said these things steadily, without theatrics, as someone who had been through enough grief to have found a way to carry it that didn't require him to hide it. Claire told him about her mother, about the particular kind of loneliness that comes when the one person who knew your whole history is gone and you realize there are things about yourself that only existed in their memory. She hadn't said that out loud before to anyone. It surprised her that it came out as easily as it did. "You've been carrying that a while," he said. "Yeah." She turned her coffee cup. "It gets lighter, slowly." "It does," he agreed. They walked back to her car in the cold. At the corner, he stopped and looked at her in the January afternoon light, slightly windburned, one hand in his jacket pocket, looking exactly like what he was. A man who was uncertain and hoping and trying not to need this too much. "Saturday next week?" he said. "Sophie's invited," Claire said immediately. He blinked. Then something in his face opened up the way a room opens when someone pulls back a curtain. "Yeah? Obviously, yeah, she's half the reason I like Saturdays now." Only half, she did not say. But he heard it anyway. She could tell by the way he looked at her. "Saturday," he said. "Saturday," she confirmed. She drove home and sat in her parked car for 10 minutes before going inside and let herself feel it properly. The thing that had been growing under everything else for months, the inconvenient, specific, increasingly undeniable fact of him. Then she went upstairs and made tea and painted for 3 hours, and didn't answer her phone when it rang, because it was probably a spam call, and she was in the middle of something that was going well, and some things deserved not to be interrupted. That was January. February came in cold and stubborn, and the 3 of them found a rhythm that wasn't named but was unmistakable. Saturdays belonged to something. Adrian took them to a small natural history museum Sophie had decided needed to be revisited in full detail, aisle by aisle, which took most of a morning and was genuinely the most interesting museum experience Claire had had in years, because Sophie asked questions that the placards never addressed. Like, why did the mammoth want to be in the cold? And if the dinosaurs didn't know they were going to disappear, were they happy? Adrian fielded most of these with a patience and specificity that impressed her. He'd looked things up, she realized. He'd gone home after the last visit and looked up the actual answers so he'd be ready. She didn't comment on it, but she noticed. He started leaving before she finished her shift some mornings and texting her afterward, short messages. Nothing that required a particular response, just the continuation of whatever they'd been talking about. A photo of something Sophie had drawn, a question about a local gallery she'd mentioned. Once, at 11 at night, a message that said simply, "I made broccoli for dinner." Sophie said it was the worst thing that had happened this week. For context, she also fell off her bike this week. Claire laughed out loud in her empty apartment at that one and typed back, "You have to roast it. Roasting changes everything. I boiled it." Adrian, I know. Why did you boil it? I don't know. I panicked. She was smiling so widely at her phone screen that she had to consciously compose herself before typing. Saturday. I'll show you how to roast vegetables. This is now part of my function in your life. A pause. Then, you have a lot of functions in my life. She put her phone down and looked at the ceiling of her apartment for a moment. Then she picked it up and typed, likewise. She sent it before she could edit it. She put the phone face down on the table, then face up, then face down again. He didn't reply for a few minutes. Then, good. That was it. Just good. And somehow that was the most complete sentence she'd read in months. She didn't tell Deb explicitly. She didn't need to. Deb had eyes and a brain and 30 years of watching people sit across from each other in her cafe, and she'd watched the shift happen in real time. What she said eventually was, "You look different." Different how? Less like you're waiting for something to go wrong. Claire thought about that. Is that good? It's human, Deb said. Which is better. The thing that changed the texture of everything happened on a Thursday in the third week of February. It started small, as the things that change textures usually do. A woman came into the cafe at 10 in the morning, mid-50s, well-dressed in the particular way of money that has stopped needing to announce itself. Silver hair cut cleanly, the kind of posture that comes from a childhood full of someone telling you to sit up straight. She came in alone, ordered a black coffee at the counter, and then stood at the window instead of sitting, scanning the room in a way that wasn't tourist casual, but purposeful. Claire was at the coffee station refilling the carafe when she clocked the woman. Something about her, the focus, the controlled energy of someone on a specific errand, registered as distinct from the usual morning crowd. The woman's gaze landed on the window table, on Adrian. Adrian, who had come in 20 minutes ago with Sophie, who was currently explaining to him why her teacher was wrong about something involving the solar system. He had his back to most of the room and hadn't seen her come in. The woman set her coffee down on the counter, took 3 steps toward his table, and stopped. Adrian looked up. The look on his face, Claire was watching, she couldn't help watching, was complicated. Not quite fear, not quite resignation. Something in between those things, controlled immediately, the door closing fast. "Margaret," he said. The woman, Margaret, looked at Sophie first. Her expression softened fractionally. "She looks like Nora," she said. "More every time." I know. There was a weight to this exchange that Claire could feel from 6 feet away. She turned back to the coffee station and did not pretend to be interested, but she was aware of it. The way you're aware of a conversation happening in the next room, not listening deliberately, but unable to fully screen out. "I've been trying to reach you," Margaret said. Her voice was quiet and controlled. "Your assistant says you're unreachable before noon." "I'm not unreachable," Adrian said. "I'm with Sophie." "The board meeting is in 2 weeks." "I know when the board meeting is." "There are people asking questions, Adrian, about the Wentworth acquisition, about your visibility." A pause. "About whether you're planning to come back properly." Sophie had gone very still in that way children do when they're pretending not to listen while listening to everything. "This isn't the right place," Adrian said, low, firm. "You haven't given me a right place. You haven't returned calls. I've given you 14 months and I'm—" She stopped herself, looked at Sophie again, back at Adrian. "We need to talk, not here." "I'll call you this week," he said. "You said that 2 weeks ago." Margaret, a beat. The woman looked at him for a moment with an expression Claire couldn't decode. Something complicated, something with more history in it than she could see from where she stood. Then she picked up her coffee, turned, and walked back to the door. On her way out, she paused. Her eyes found Claire. Assessed her with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to assessing situations quickly and accurately. Then she left. Claire went back to her tables. She checked on table 2 and table 5 and brought the newspaper man his refill and did not look at Adrian's table for a full 7 minutes, which was more discipline than she'd known she had. When she did, Sophie was drawing again, head down, pencil moving with fierce concentration. And Adrian was sitting with both hands flat on the table, looking at nothing, the controlled blank expression that meant the opposite of controlled. She went over. "Everything okay?" she said. He looked up, found her eyes. The expression shifted, not relaxing exactly, but orienting, like a compass needle finding north. "That was someone from work," he said. "It's fine." "Okay." She didn't push. She'd learned that with him. You could hold a space without filling it. "Sophie, what are you drawing?" "The planet Neptune," Sophie said without looking up. "Because Mrs. Foster is wrong about its color. It's not just blue, it has storms." "She's not wrong about that," Claire confirmed. "Neptune is complicated." "Most things are," Sophie said, with the tone of someone who has recently observed this to be consistently true. Adrian looked at his daughter, and something moved through his face, quick and private. He reached over and put his hand on top of Sophie's briefly, just rested it there for a second, then withdrew. Sophie glanced up at him, then went back to Neptune. Claire left them to it. But the morning had shifted slightly. Something had come in with Margaret and stayed. She felt it again when Adrian came to pay his check. He handed her his card. Different card, new one since November, she'd noticed months ago. And while she was running it, he said, without looking at her, "She's on the board of my company. Margaret. She and Nora were close. She's been—" He paused. "She checks in." "She seems like someone who takes checking in seriously," Claire said. "She does." He took his card back. "She's not wrong that I've been—" He stopped. "I've been doing things differently this past few months, in terms of how much time I put into work." Claire looked at him. "Good differently or problem differently?" He met her eyes. "Both, depending on who you ask." That sat in her mind for the rest of the shift and into the evening. She made dinner and painted and kept coming back to it. The word company, the word board, the woman who moved through a crowded cafe like she was used to rooms rearranging themselves around her. She tried to build a picture from the pieces she had and found that the pieces, which had seemed sufficient before, had some gaps in them she hadn't noticed. She knew his first name. She knew he had a company. She knew he lived somewhere in the city that he'd never precisely specified. She knew he drove a dark SUV, which she'd seen once from the window when he was buckling Sophie in, and that he had a grandmother-in-law he trusted with his daughter, and that he owned more than one dark jacket, and not many more clothes than that, seemingly. She knew how he drank his coffee and what made him laugh, and how he looked at his daughter, and the specific quality of his attention when she was talking about something she meant. She didn't know his last name. It hadn't been relevant. It still wasn't relevant, she told herself. But the pieces had a shape she was starting to notice. It was Deb who filled in the shape, in the end. Accidentally, without knowing she was doing it. The first Saturday in March, Claire came in an hour before her shift to handle a scheduling conflict and found Deb at the back counter going through mail. Deb looked up when she came in. "Was that Adrian Vale in here this week?" Deb said. Claire stopped moving. "What?" Deb held up her phone, the spare one she kept at the cafe, which she used exclusively for the business account, and looking up recipes, and apparently, this. The screen showed a business article. The headline was something about a Tennessee investment firm and a major acquisition. The photo was small and professionally taken, a man in a suit at some kind of formal event. The suit was different, the setting was different, the jaw was clean-shaved in the photo in a way she'd never seen, but the eyes were the same. The exact same dark, quiet, light not reflecting eyes. Adrian Vale, the caption read, CEO of Vale Capital Group, one of Tennessee's largest private investment firms. Claire stood and looked at the photo for a moment. The room didn't tilt. She didn't feel the floor go out from under her. It was more like watching a picture come into focus. The same image, clearer now, with details that had been there all along. "That's him?" Deb said. She wasn't salacious about it. She was just asking. "Yeah," Claire said, and her voice was even. "That's him. He's been coming in here for 4 months and you didn't know. He never said his last name, I never asked." Deb looked at her with some combination of respect and alarm. "Claire, I know. That's a significant—" "I know, Deb." She put on her apron and went to work. She was very good at going to work. She had years of practice going to work when other things were happening. She pulled tables and set up the coffee station and did all the ordinary things in the correct order, and she thought, he knew. He had known who she was, and she hadn't known who he was. And at some point early on, that asymmetry had solidified into something he'd been carrying around and she'd been completely unaware of. She thought about the declined card, about the worn jacket and the plain jeans and the way he'd said, "I'm Adrian without weight," without the surname that apparently had quite a lot of weight attached to it. She thought about Margaret saying your visibility and the board meeting, and people are asking questions. And she thought about the private school with the nice uniforms and the SUV and all the $50 tips on $7 coffees. And she thought about the fact that she'd noticed those things and had chosen, each time, to file them away in the drawer labeled "Not My Business." And she thought about how maybe she had not been as unobservant as she was currently feeling. She thought about what he'd said in the bookstore. "I have a life that's complicated." She had thought he meant grief. She had understood it as grief. He had meant more than that. He had meant something much larger than that. She worked through the morning. She was polite and competent, and she did not let anything show, which was a skill she'd developed not at this job but before it, in the years when showing things had consequences she couldn't afford. He came in at 10:15. No Sophie. School day. He sat at the window table. She brought his coffee. She set it down. She looked at him. He looked at her, and she saw it. The thing she hadn't had the context to see before. The watchfulness in how he waited. The way he was watching to see what she knew. "Vale Capital Group," she said quietly. His jaw tightened, just slightly. He nodded. "How long have you known me without me knowing that?" she said. Not an accusation exactly, a real question. "Since the beginning," he said. "The card that was declined. It was a card I keep for—" He stopped. "For times when I don't want to be—" He stopped again. Then, plainly, "I keep a card that isn't linked to anything publicly traceable. For ordinary things. Sometimes it doesn't work properly." She sat down across from him. She did this slowly, deliberately, the way you sit down when you're deciding not to run from something. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said. He looked at her. "When should I have told you? That first morning? Before or after you paid for my coffee?" Something moved in his voice. "I'd met you 40 minutes before. I didn't tell you because it wasn't relevant yet. And after it became relevant?" "I was afraid," he said. Direct. Unusually direct, even for him. She waited. "Every person in my professional life. He pressed his mouth together. Tried again. "After Nora died, I found out what it looks like when people care about your circumstances instead of you. I watched it happen in real time. People who'd been friends behaving like assets to be repositioned. People who'd been employees behaving like I owed them my grief on a schedule." His voice was steady, but it was the steadiness of something controlled, not something easy. I don't think you're that. I don't think you've ever been that. But the longer I waited, the harder it became to tell me. To tell you without it becoming the thing that defined everything before it." Claire sat with that for a moment. "How much?" she said. He looked at her. "How much are we talking about?" she said. "Because there's a range between has more money than me and—" She gestured vaguely at his phone. "Enough that it changes how people act when they find out," he said. "Reliably. Every time." She looked at him across the table. At the dark jacket, the worn jeans, the coffee going slightly cold between his hands. "I paid $12 for your breakfast," she said. "I know. I counted that against my grocery budget for the week." "I know that too." His voice had something in it she couldn't name. "That's— Claire, that is the thing. That's exactly the thing. You paid $12 you didn't have and you didn't make it into anything. You didn't make it into a transaction. You just—" He stopped. "You just did it because it was in front of you. It wasn't a complicated decision. It should have been," he said. "For where you were financially, it should have cost you something to make it, and you made it like it was nothing." "It was $12, she said. "It wasn't nothing, but it wasn't—" She stopped. Something was tightening in her chest that she was trying to identify. "Adrian, I'm not angry that you have money. I know what you're not angry about," he said. "Tell me what you are." She looked at him. He was right to ask that directly. She respected him for it. She sorted through it carefully. "I'm sitting here realizing that you knew something significant about the balance of this situation, and I didn't, and that makes me feel like I've been making decisions without full information." "Yes," he said. "That's fair. It doesn't, she exhaled, it doesn't change what I feel, which is its own problem because I'd rather it change something, so I had a cleaner response to it. His expression shifted. The door that was usually most of the way closed opened just a fraction more. I'm going to tell you everything, he said, if you want that. Everything I've been. He paused. Not hiding. I wasn't hiding, but not saying. I want that, she said. Okay. Not here, she said. Not today. He nodded. Whenever you're ready. She stood up. She had tables to cover and a shift to finish and a version of herself to maintain until she could get home and figure out how she actually felt about all of this in the privacy of her own apartment. Your coffee's cold, she said. It's fine. I'll bring you a fresh one. She went to the coffee station and stood there for a moment with her back to the room. She breathed. She thought about the painting in her sketchbook, the man at the window, the title she'd given it in her own head. The stranger. He wasn't a stranger anymore. He was also significantly more complicated than she'd known. Both of those things were true at the same time, which she was finding to be a recurring feature of life that she hadn't quite finished making peace with. She poured fresh coffee into a clean cup and brought it back to his table and set it down without speaking. He looked up at her with that particular expression, careful, hoping, waiting to see what came next. Saturday, she said. You said you'd tell me everything, so Saturday. Saturday, he said. She went back to work. Outside the window, Nashville carried on. The morning crowd thinned into the mid-morning quiet, and the regular man with the newspaper folded it under his arm and nodded to Claire on his way out, and the older woman who came for chamomile arrived 7 minutes late and seemed flustered by it. Ordinary morning, ordinary city, ordinary life. Except for the man at the window table with his second coffee, who was not ordinary in the ways she'd discovered too late to have done anything differently about, and who was looking at her when she glanced up the way someone looks at a thing they are afraid of losing before they ever quite got to hold it. She looked away. She collected a check. She smiled at a toddler who waved at her from a stroller near the door. She held the Saturday in her chest like a held breath. Whatever was coming, she needed to know. She'd always needed to know. That had never been the part she was afraid of. What she was afraid of, what she'd been quietly afraid of for weeks without fully naming it, was finding out and still wanting it. Finding out and finding that the wanting didn't change. Because that would mean she was already somewhere much harder to climb back from than she'd let herself believe. Saturday came the way difficult things usually came. On time, without mercy, preceded by a Friday night in which Claire slept poorly and painted 2 things she didn't like and deleted 4 text message drafts. She'd started writing to Marcus before deciding she wasn't ready to explain anything yet. She told Marcus almost everything in her adult life eventually. He was her person in that specific way. Not the person she called first in a crisis necessarily, but the person she told the full version to once the crisis had settled enough to have a shape. She told him about the sessions being cut. She'd told him about the car. She'd told him about the man who came to the cafe with his daughter, though she'd told it lightly, in the way you tell things when you're not sure yet what they are. She had not told him about Vale Capital Group. She hadn't been ready to hear what Marcus would say about that. Partly because Marcus was perceptive in the way of people who have spent significant time in their own heads sorting things out, and she suspected he would say something accurate and slightly unwelcome, and she wasn't there yet. Friday night she lay on her couch and looked at the painting she'd done of the river and thought about what Adrian had said in the bookstore. I have a life that's complicated. She'd heard grief. She'd understood grief. Grief she could meet with something real because she'd lived inside it herself. But this was different. This was a category of complication she had no personal reference point for, and the lack of reference point made her feel, underneath everything else, slightly foolish in a way she resented. She wasn't foolish. She knew that rationally. She'd had incomplete information, and she'd responded to what was in front of her, which was what you did. But the feeling sat in her chest anyway, the way feelings do when they're not interested in being argued with. She got up at 7, made coffee, put on the jacket with the broken zipper because she still hadn't replaced the zipper. And some things just were what they were. And she went outside and walked for 40 minutes because sometimes the only way to think clearly was to put your body in motion and let the thinking happen in the background. Nashville in early March was neither winter nor spring, but something restless in between. The trees were starting to consider the possibility of leaves. The river was still winter gray, but the light on it was changing, warmer at the edges, something returning. She walked along the pedestrian bridge and stopped at the railing and looked at the water the way she'd done with the two of them back in November. And she thought about how much had accumulated since then in the space between herself and another person, and how strange it was that accumulation happened even when you weren't tracking it. She went home. She showered. She put on actual clothes, real clothes, not the ones she wore to get through days, but the dark green sweater that she'd bought 2 winters ago and only wore when she meant something by it, without letting herself examine that choice too closely. He picked her up at 11, which was not their usual rhythm, but was what Saturday had become. No Sophie. She was with her grandmother again for the weekend, and Claire was aware that that meant something, that he'd arranged for Sophie to be elsewhere because he'd decided this conversation needed space around it. I was driving a different car. She hadn't seen this one before. Not the dark SUV, a dark sedan, newer, with the particular quiet that meant quality insulation. She didn't mention it. She got in. He looked at her. She looked at him. He looked like he'd also slept badly, which made her feel fractionally better in the way that misery averaged out sometimes provides. I thought we'd drive, he said. Where? Outside the city. There's a property I want to show you. He paused. If that's okay? If you'd rather stay in the city. Outside is fine, she said. They drove southeast in a quiet that was mostly comfortable and partly the kind of tense that comes from two people with something large waiting to be said, choosing to wait until the right moment for it. He put on music, something instrumental, low and unhurried, and she looked at the city turning into suburb, turning into the looser, greener geometry of the counties outside Nashville. About 40 minutes out, he turned off the main road onto a private drive. The gate at the end of it, she noticed the gate, the security panel, opened automatically as they approached. He'd been here before. He knew the code or had the device. She didn't say anything. The property opened up beyond the gate into what must have been 60 or 70 acres of land, rolling hills, bare branched trees, brown winter grass that still had the bones of something that would be beautiful in spring. There was a main house set back from the drive, large and old, with a wide porch and stone foundations, and the kind of settled into the landscape look that comes from decades rather than design. There was a separate structure off to the right, a cottage or outbuilding, also old. She looked at the house for a moment. Yours? She said. It belonged to Nora's family originally. She grew up coming here for summers. He stopped the car near the porch. I keep it. I don't always know why. They got out. The air here was cleaner than the city, colder, carrying the smell of bare earth and old grass. Wind moved through the trees on the hill with a low, continuous sound. It was the kind of place that had weather opinions. She stood and looked around at it. The emptiness of it was not uncomfortable. It was more like a large room that had been waiting patiently. Okay, she said. Tell me. He put his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the house and told her. He told it the way someone tells a thing they've organized in their own mind and are choosing to present with as little editorializing as possible, which was a way of telling that she respected even when what was being told was significant. Vail Capital Group had been built by his father, Thomas Vail, over 30 years, starting from a regional investment operation and eventually expanding into one of the largest private capital firms in the state. Adrian had come into the business in his mid-20s with the understanding that he would eventually run it, which he'd done since he was 29. The company managed a portfolio of assets that he described in numbers that she absorbed without reacting to, which took some discipline. The Nashville office was the headquarters. There were others in Atlanta and Chicago. He had a board, a management team, the woman named Margaret, who was vice chair and who had been Nora's godmother, and who had been trying to herd him back toward full operational engagement since the funeral. The house he lived in was not far from Belle Meade. It was not small. The plain jacket and the jeans and the declined card, those were deliberate. He had a version of himself he moved through the public city in when he wasn't being Adrian Vail, the CEO. He developed it after Nora died when he'd found that taking Sophie to a coffee shop in his work clothes meant 3 people had recognized him and one had tried to have a business conversation while Sophie was eating her muffin. The alternative had been to stop going places, which he'd tried for about 6 weeks before concluding it was making both of them worse. So the life you've been living in here, Claire said, gesturing at the city generally, since I've known you, that's the version you chose. Yes, and the other version is also real, he said. It's not a performance. The company is real. The responsibilities are real. The people who need things from me in that context are real. He paused. But over time, it became the thing that ate everything else. After Nora died, I had 16-hour days because that was easier than being present anywhere else. I had a 6-year-old daughter who was learning to be invisible because she knew her father was performing functionality and couldn't be interrupted. He said it flatly, without self-forgiveness. My housekeeper, Pauline, she's been with us since before Sophie was born. She told me in October of that year that Sophie had started apologizing before she asked me anything. Sorry, Daddy, but every single time. A 4-year-old had decided she needed to pre-apologize for existing. Claire was quiet. I restructured, he said. I pulled back from the day-to-day significantly. Margaret runs operations. I approve major decisions. I'm active in strategy. I attend what I need to attend. But I stopped letting it consume everything. He looked at the house. We started going to the city more, getting coffee, finding things to do that were just about being people in a place, not schedules. I bought the prepaid card because I didn't want to be recognized every time I bought a sandwich. And then the card got declined, Claire said. And then the card got declined. Something moved in his expression. And you paid for it. You paid for my daughter's hot chocolate without making it into anything. Without the look. I know the look, Claire. The one people get when they realize who I am. Everything recalculates. You can see it happening in real time. He looked at her. You didn't have that look. You looked like someone who had noticed a problem and fixed it because it was in front of you. That's what it was, she said. I know. He exhaled. I came back the next morning because I didn't know what to do with that. I'd been going years without anyone doing a simple thing simply. She looked at the hills. The winter light was thin and clean and honest. I'm not poor in the movies way, she said. I want to say that. It's not. She was choosing words. I have a job and a roof, and my brother is okay. It's just tight. It's been tight for a long time, and I've gotten good at tight. And I'm not a charity case, and I'm not a redemption story. And I'd like you to know that explicitly. I know that, he said, immediate. That's not, Claire, that has never been how I see you. Okay. I mean that. I know you mean it. She turned to face him. He was looking at her with that particular focused attention, not evaluating, not calculating, just present, completely present in the way he could be when he chose to be, which she had found over months to be one of the more unusual things about him. Most people, even people who liked you, were partially somewhere else. He was not. I'm not angry at you. I want to say that too. Something in his shoulders released fractionally. I'm also not. I don't know what I am, she said. I've been trying to figure that out since Thursday morning, and I haven't landed anywhere clean yet. That's fair. It's a lot, she said. It's a lot of information, and I'm someone who makes decisions carefully when decisions are actually big, and this is actually big, and She stopped. I need to think about what I'm walking into. Yes, he said, simply, without trying to preempt her conclusion or smooth it over. That mattered. The fact that he said yes and didn't immediately follow it with a list of reassurances, that mattered. They walked for a while, around the edges of the property, not talking much, which somehow felt right. The wind had dropped, and the light had improved slightly. The kind of thin early March sun that wasn't warm but was better than nothing. She found herself looking at the stone outbuilding as they passed it. The cottage, windows intact, door locked, ivy beginning its slow campaign up one exterior wall. What is that? She said. Used to be a studio. Nora's mother painted. Watercolors. Mostly landscape. He glanced at it. I've been meaning to do something with it. I don't know what. Claire looked at the building for a long moment, the proportions of it, the light coming through the east-facing windows even in winter. It's a good space for it, she said. The north light would be better, but that window, she pointed at the largest one. That's good. That's workable. He looked at her, then at the building, then back at her. Yeah, he said. She shook her head slightly, not at him, at herself. Some habits ran deeper than the circumstances you put them in. She could not look at a room with good natural light without doing the math on it. They went back to the house. He made coffee, badly, she noted, black and over-extracted in the way of someone who drank enough coffee to need it functional, but had never fully committed to learning to make it well. And they sat at the large kitchen table that was too big for two people, and she held her cup, and they talked for a long time. She asked questions, and he answered them. Not just about the company, about all of it. Years building it. The marriage to Nora, who she was starting to build a picture of from fragments. Loud laugh, landscape architect, fierce and funny, and not interested in pretense. The loss of her. The 6 months afterward that he described with a bluntness that must have been hard to arrive at. The slow, imperfect rebuilding. She told him things too. Things she hadn't said in the cafe because the cafe had a rhythm that didn't accommodate full honesty, only increments of it. She told him about her mother dying and the specific financial aftermath of it, the debts that had been invisible until they weren't, the cost of grief measured in practical numbers. She told him about the years when she'd set down the idea of going back to school and picked up the idea of survival instead, and how those two pivots were related, and she'd never fully made peace with the second one. She was trying to be precise. It's not that I'm unhappy with the life I have. I am genuinely. She thought about Sophie's crow of delight the morning she'd nailed the perspective on her horse drawing. She thought about the Tuesday classes with the teenagers who pretended they didn't care and then stayed late. There are things in my life that I wouldn't trade, genuinely. But there's a version of it I can see from here that I can't quite reach because the distance between here and there is just, she tapped the table, money. It's just money. And I'm aware of how that sounds. It doesn't sound like anything except true, he said. I've thought about a studio space, she said. Not a gallery. Not for me. For kids. A real one. With materials that aren't donated leftovers, and hours that aren't contingent on whatever the community center decides to cut next. Bennett Art House, he said. She blinked. What? That's what I'd call it, he said. If it were mine to name. He was looking at her with that calm, steady expression. Bennett, because it should have your name on it. Art House, because that's what it is. Not a program, not a session, a house. Somewhere that belongs to the work. She looked at him. I've thought about it, he said. A lot, since you told me about the Thursday session being cut. You knew about the Thursday session? You mentioned it in January. You said it like it wasn't a big thing, and you were very composed about it, and you went straight to refilling Table 6's coffee, and you didn't say anything else about it. He paused. I noticed. She didn't know what to do with being noticed that specifically. Adrian, she said, I'm not. He held up one hand slightly. I'm not proposing to fix your life. I want to be extremely clear about that. I know what that would feel like, and I know you don't want it, and I don't want to give it to you. He put his hand back around his coffee mug. But I have more resources than I need, and you have a thing that's worth doing that you can't fully do because of resources. And I am. He stopped. I'm a person who has been watching you for 4 months, and I am not in any kind of neutral position about you. And I wanted to say all of that before anything else, so there's no confusion about what this is or what it's attached to. She sat and looked at him across the large kitchen table. What exactly are you saying? She said. I'm saying that I'd like to help find the space. Not give it to you. Find it, fund it, make it possible. And I'd like you to run it the way you want to run it without my name attached to it, or my opinion inserted into it, because it's your work and your vision, and that needs to stay yours. He was choosing words the way she recognized as his careful mode. And I'm also saying, separately from that I would like to continue whatever this is between us, without the financial component being the thing that drives it or complicates it. Those two things can't be fully separate, she said. No, he agreed. They can't. That's the part I don't know how to solve cleanly. She sat with that. If I say yes to the studio thing, she said slowly, I need it to be mine, completely. I run it, I staff it, I make every decision about it. Yes. You don't get input on programming or philosophy or who I accept as students. Agreed. And if something happens between us, good or bad, it doesn't affect the studio. I was quiet for a moment. That's the part that requires trust, he said, because I can agree to it right now and mean it, but you'd have to trust that I'd hold to it. I know, she said. I'm aware I'm asking you to promise something complicated. I'll hold to it, he said. I will not use the studio as leverage, in any direction. Claire, that's not who I am. She believed him. She examined the belief and found it solid, not wishful. She'd spent 4 months watching who he was, and this was consistent with it. I need to think about it, she said. Take all the time you need. I might say no. That's your right. I might say yes and then need to renegotiate things. Also, you're right. She picked up her coffee, drank the over-extracted terrible coffee without mentioning it. You really do make bad coffee, she said. He looked at his mug. I know, I've known for years. I keep thinking I'll improve. You won't improve unless someone teaches you. Is that an offer? It might be, she said. Something passed between them across the table. The specific warmth of a moment where two people are standing at the edge of something together, and neither of them is pretending otherwise. She didn't reach across the table, and he didn't either, but the not reaching had its own quality, the kind of restraint that's really a form of attention. She drove home in his car. He drove her, she meant. He drove her home. And at the curb outside her building, he stopped and put the car in park, and they sat for a moment. The painting in my sketchbook, she said. The one Sophie showed you. The river. I painted it from memory. After we walked. I didn't plan to. I just sat down that night, and it's what came out. She was looking at her hands. I've been painting you from memory since November. Not just that one. Multiple. She looked at him. I thought you should know that. His expression was impossible to fully read in the low light, but his jaw did the thing, the release of something he'd been holding. I've been doing a version of that in my head, he said, quiet. Without the skill. She opened the car door. Cold air came in. Saturday, she said. Saturday, he said. She went upstairs. She sat on the couch and didn't paint and didn't do anything for about 20 minutes. Then she called Marcus. Hey, he said. What's up? I need to tell you something. Several things, actually. A pause. Should I sit down? Probably. She heard him settle somewhere, then, okay, go, she told him. Not everything in one go. It took 20 minutes and 2 digressions and one point where Marcus said, wait, go back, and she went back. She told him about Adrian. The whole Adrian, the Cafe Adrian, and the Vale Capital Adrian, and the Saturday, and the studio, and all of it. Marcus was quiet when she finished. Say something, she said. I'm processing. Marcus. He's a billionaire. Apparently. And he's been coming into the cafe for 4 months drinking regular coffee. Yes. Because he... Marcus stopped. Claire. He kept coming back because you paid for his muffin. His daughter's muffin. Because you paid for a 6-year-old's muffin, and that... She could hear him working through it. That's either the most romantic thing I've ever heard, or the most complicated. Both, she said. It's both. How do you feel? She thought about it honestly. Like I'm standing on a bridge and I can see both sides and I haven't decided which way I'm walking yet. But you want to walk somewhere. Yes, she said. That's the honest answer. Yes. Then walk, Marcus said. Just don't... He paused. Don't disappear into it, okay? Whatever it becomes. Don't lose you in it. I'm not going to lose me in it. Promise me. Marcus, I need to hear it. I promise, she said. And meant it. She had spent too long building herself out of scarce materials to hand herself over to any version of anything, however warm it felt. That wasn't bitterness. It was just accurate self-knowledge. Okay, he said. Good. Then, a billionaire. In Nashville. Drinking black coffee at your cafe for 4 months. Yes. Has he seen your apartment? No. Claire. His voice was full of something that was half alarm and half laughter. Your walls are covered. I know. Like covered. There's a painting behind the toilet. It's a good painting. It's behind the toilet, Claire. She laughed. It came out more easily than she expected. The big, unself-conscious kind. The kind that had been sitting in her chest under all the weight of the week, waiting for the right exit. She laughed until her eyes watered, and Marcus laughed with her because that was the thing about Marcus. Whatever the situation, he always found the same joke she did. When it settled, she sat in the comfortable aftermath of it. I think I'm going to say yes to the studio, she said, when I'm ready. Yeah? It's a good idea. It was my idea first, anyway. He just said it back to me. She looked at the paintings on the walls. The full, crowded, absolutely ridiculous number of paintings on every surface of her small apartment. Bennett Art House. That's a good name, Marcus said. Yeah, she said, it is. She hung up and sat in her apartment and looked at the paintings and thought about an east-facing window in a stone outbuilding on a hill outside Nashville and what it would feel like to fill a room like that with children and color and the specific joy of someone who has just discovered that they made a thing and the thing is real. She thought about it for a long time. Then she opened her sketchbook to a blank page and started drawing the floor plan of a room she didn't have yet. She drew it carefully, to scale, placing windows and light sources, and the arrangement of long work tables, the way the storage would work, the corner that could be a quiet spot for the kid who needed to not be in the middle of everything. She drew it the way she had drawn hundreds of things in her life, without certainty about the outcome, but with the absolute conviction that the drawing itself was worth making. The winter outside her window was finally, reluctantly, starting to consider giving way to something warmer. She kept drawing. The floor plan she'd drawn that night stayed on her drawing table for 2 weeks. She didn't hide it, but she didn't act on it either. It sat there at the edge of her workspace while she painted other things, while she went to work, while she taught her remaining Tuesday sessions, and watched the community center's fluorescent lights flicker overhead, and thought about east-facing windows and what real light did to a room full of children trying to make something. She said yes on a Thursday morning in mid-March. Not to Adrian directly. She texted him, which she'd thought about and decided was actually the right medium for it, because saying it in person would have made it into a moment, and she wasn't ready for it to be a moment yet. She needed it to be a decision first, clean and separate from the feeling. "I've thought about it," she wrote. "I want to do the studio. My terms, as we discussed. If you're still offering." His reply came in 4 minutes. "Still offering. Your terms? Completely. Tell me where to start." She looked at the phone for a moment. Then she typed, "Find me a space downtown. Ground floor, good natural light, room for 20 students. I'll handle everything else. I'll have options by Monday." She put the phone down and went back to the community center and taught her Tuesday class and watched a 12-year-old named Destiny figure out negative space for the first time. The moment when you understand that the shape around the thing is as important as the thing itself, and felt the particular irreplaceable satisfaction of being present for that specific kind of discovery. She thought, 20 kids like this. 40? Every Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday. Real supplies, real time, real space. She thought, yes, this is right. Monday came with 3 addresses. She visited them all on her day off, alone, without Adrian, because she needed to evaluate them on her own terms without his presence affecting how she saw the rooms. The first was too corporate, the kind of renovated space that still smelled like its previous incarnation as something transactional. The second was actually perfect in dimensions, but on a 3rd floor with no reliable elevator, which eliminated it immediately. She'd had students in wheelchairs, would have them again, and accessibility wasn't optional. The third was on a corner of a block she knew, half a mile from Magnolia Morning, ground floor of an older building that had been a print shop, and before that, based on the ghost of signage still visible on the brick exterior, some kind of map-making operation. The floors were worn wood. The front windows faced east. The back room caught cross-ventilation from 2 directions. She stood in the middle of the empty main room for a long time. It smelled like old wood and potential, which was maybe the best thing a room could smell like. She called Adrian from the sidewalk outside. "The third one," she said, when he picked up. "You sure? The floors are good. The light is good. The neighborhood kids can walk to it." She looked up at the building's face, at the ghost letters in the brick. "It used to be a print shop." "I know. I looked into all 3 before I sent them." "Of course you did." She almost smiled. "The print shop, that's the one." He bought the building. She didn't ask the price, and he didn't tell her. And this was a negotiated silence they'd reached without discussing it. There were numbers in his life that she was going to have to find a way to not let define everything, and the first step in that was not making every number into a confrontation. He bought the building, and the renovation began in April with a contractor he'd used before, and she attended every planning meeting and made every decision about the interior without consultation, which he had promised, and which he held to without apparent difficulty, because when Adrian Vale made a promise, he seemed to treat it as a structural element rather than an intention. She quit the cafe on a Tuesday in April. That was hard in a way she hadn't fully anticipated. She'd been at Magnolia Morning for 2.5 years, and the work had been honest, and the people had been real, and the cafe had been the place where her life had changed in a direction she was still mapping. She gave Deb 3 weeks' notice, which was more than required and exactly right. Deb received the news by looking at her over the reading glasses that were perpetually on top of her head and saying, "It's about time." "I'm going to miss this," Claire said. "The early mornings and the bad tips and the guy at table 3 who thinks decaf is a moral failing. All of it." Deb studied her for a moment. Then she came around the counter and hugged her once, briefly, firmly, The hug of a woman who didn't do it often and meant it completely when she did. Come back for coffee, Deb said. Paying customer, not before 7. Never before 7, Claire agreed. Her last shift was a Sunday. She worked it like any other day because that was the only way she knew how to work. Fully, without sentimentality about the work itself, because the work deserved to be done right until the last minute. At the end of it, the Sunday crew put together something small. A card. A grocery store cake with yellow frosting. A playlist of country music nobody could agree on, but everyone tolerated. The man who read the physical newspaper shook her hand gravely. The older woman who came for chamomile tea on Wednesdays had come on a Sunday specifically and brought her a small painted tin of shortbread and said, softly, "You always made me feel welcome, dear." And that hit somewhere Claire hadn't been braced for. She drove home with yellow frosting on her sleeve and sat in her apartment and cried for about 15 minutes. Not grief exactly, not regret, but the specific emotional texture of a chapter closing, which felt different from sadness but required the same release. Then she got up and made tea and pulled out her sketchbook and started planning the first semester of classes. Adrian showed up with Sophie that Saturday carrying a peace lily in a clay pot and looking slightly uncertain about whether this was the right plant to bring to a situation. Sophie picked it, he said. She said it was the most alive-looking one. Sophie already passed him and into the apartment, stopped, and looked at the walls with the full-body attention she brought to anything that interested her. "You have so many," she said. It was not a complaint, it was wonder. "I do," Claire said. "Can I look at all of them?" "You can look at all of them." Sophie began a methodical circuit of the room, examining each painting at whatever height it hung, going up on her toes for the higher ones. Adrian set the plant on the windowsill next to the dried-out pine branch that Claire still hadn't thrown away, and looked at the floor plan still sitting on the drawing table. "Is this it?" he said. "First draft. I've revised it 4 times since then." He studied it. He didn't say anything evaluative, didn't say this looks good or I like what you've done. He just looked at it the way someone looks at something they're trying to fully understand. "The corner in the back," he said. "You've got a table there, but it's separated. For the kids who need to be adjacent to the group but not in it. Some of my best students work better at a slight remove. They're listening and participating, but they need the option of a little distance." He looked at her. "That's a specific thing to know. Kids tell you things if you pay attention to the shape of how they work." He nodded, went back to looking at the plan. Sophie appeared at Claire's elbow, having completed her survey. "The one in the bathroom is my favorite," Sophie announced. "That's what everyone says," Claire said. "Because it's the best one?" "Because it surprises people. They're not expecting something good in there." Sophie considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "I think that's the best place to put good things," she said, "where people aren't expecting them." Claire looked at her. At this 7-year-old in her uneven pigtails, more even now than they'd been in November, the daily practice paying off, who had apparently developed a philosophy of pleasant surprises without intending to. "Yeah," Claire said, "I think you're right." Adrian, still looking at the floor plan, made a soft sound. Not a word. Just the small involuntary exhale of someone whose kid has just said something that caught them in the chest. The renovation finished in late May. It took 6 weeks, slightly over schedule, because the floors required more work than the contractor had anticipated, and slightly over budget for the same reason, which Claire registered and Adrian absorbed without comment. She'd been clear going in that overruns on the physical space were his domain. She'd taken responsibility for everything inside, which meant supplies, furniture, programming, staffing, and he didn't push back on costs he'd agreed to carry. She appreciated the discipline of that. The first time she walked through the finished space alone, she stood in the middle of the main room and felt something she didn't immediately have words for. It was hers. Not in the sense that she owned it, she didn't, she knew the legal reality, but in the sense that every decision in it had come from her, every arrangement of space and light and table and shelf had been made according to her understanding of what children needed when they were trying to make something. The name on the glass of the front door, hand-lettered in dark green by a local sign painter she'd commissioned, Bennett Art House. She stood there for a long time. Then she called Marcus. "Come see it," she said. He came that afternoon, taking the bus from Murfreesboro and arriving with his backpack, and the particular expression he wore when he was trying not to make it obvious he was emotional. He walked through the space in silence, touching the edges of the work tables, looking at the storage systems she'd designed, stopping in front of the corner station with its slightly lower table height. "What's this for?" he said. Smaller kids, or kids who do better working closer to the ground. It's adjustable. He looked at her. His jaw was tight in the way it got when he was holding something. Claire, he said. Don't, she said, because she was already close to the edge of it herself. I'm just going to say, Marcus, you built something, he said, simple and direct. You actually built something. She pressed her lips together, looked at the room. We open in September, she said, when she trusted her voice. I know. I'm going to be here. You don't have to. I'm going to be here, he said again, with the finality of someone making a plan rather than offering a gesture. First day. I'll take the morning off. She nodded. They stood in the finished room together with its smell of fresh wood and new paint and natural light coming through the east-facing windows exactly the way she'd calculated it would. And neither of them said anything for a while because some things fill a space better than words do. The summer that followed was the busiest of her life and also, in some ways, the most grounded. She spent it building the program, curriculum, supply lists, student intake process, scholarship structure for the kids whose families couldn't pay. She hired an assistant, a 22-year-old named Jalen, who had just finished an art education degree and had 3 earrings and an opinion about everything, and was, Claire recognized immediately, exactly the kind of person you wanted in a room with young students. She lined up partnerships with 3 local schools for referrals. She set the tuition on a sliding scale that she'd calculated carefully and argued with Adrian about exactly once. You're underpricing it, he said. I'm pricing it so families can afford it. The sliding scale handles that. The base rate is what the neighborhood can absorb, she said. I know this neighborhood. I've worked in it for 3 years. I know what the families are dealing with. She looked at him. This is one of the things that is mine to decide. He held his hands up slightly. You're right. I'm sorry. She appreciated that he said it without hedging. You're allowed to have opinions, she said, just not final ones on this. Understood. They'd had a handful of disagreements by then because they'd moved into the territory where 2 people actually know each other, and the knowing includes friction. None of them had been large. They were both people who'd learned not to spend energy on the wrong arguments, but they'd been real, which mattered. She'd discovered that his version of conflict was very contained and very direct, which was easier for her than she'd expected because she was the same. No raised voices, no slamming of doors. Just 2 people saying what they actually meant until they found something they could both stand on. She'd also discovered, over the course of the summer, that there were parts of his world she was going to have to learn to navigate without losing herself in them. The dinner in June, a fundraiser for some organization on whose board he sat, a room full of people with the particular ease of money that has never been questioned, had been instructive. She'd worn the nicest thing she owned, which was a dark blue dress she'd bought for her mother's memorial service and had never fully associated with anything good until that night. She'd been fine. More than fine, actually. She was good at reading rooms and good at conversation that went somewhere real, and those skills didn't disappear just because the room was more expensive than her usual ones. But she'd come home afterward and stood in her apartment surrounded by her paintings and felt the relief of being back inside her own dimensions, and she'd thought, this is going to be a thing we have to keep working on. The toggling. The belonging to both places without losing the thread back to yourself. She'd told Adrian this plainly the following Saturday. I know, he said. I watch you in those rooms. You're fine in them. You're better than fine, honestly. But you come out tired in a specific way. Performing okay is different from being okay. Yes. He was quiet. I don't want to put you in rooms where you have to perform. You won't always be able to avoid it, she said. The company is what it is. You have obligations in spaces like that, and I'm going to be in your life, and that means I'll be in some of those spaces. She was precise. I'm not saying I can't handle it. I'm saying I'm going to need to be able to come home to something that's mine when it's over. He looked at her. The apartment, he said. The apartment. The studio. Marcus. The cafe where Deb still makes me pay for my coffee. She paused. You. The version of you that drinks terrible coffee and texts me pictures of Sophie's drawings at 11 at night. That's not a version, he said. That's just me. I know, she said. That's why I said it. Something crossed his face that she'd learned to read by then. The careful, private thing that happened when something got through the outer layer to somewhere real. You're not going to lose that, he said. Any of it. I'm not going to... Claire, I have spent a year watching who you are, and I have no interest in changing any of it. Not the apartment, not the studio, not Marcus, not the cafe. He paused. Not the painting behind the toilet. She laughed before she could stop herself. You've seen that? Sophie reported on it, extensively. It's a good painting. It's apparently your best work, according to Sophie. Sophie has taste, she said, still laughing. He smiled at her. The real one, the crooked, unused-looking one she'd first seen on a bench in Bicentennial Park over a container of pad thai. It had become more frequent over the months. It still looked like it caught him slightly off guard every time, which she'd decided was one of her favorite things about it, that it hadn't yet become automatic. Bennett Art House opened on the second Saturday of September with 23 students enrolled, an open house that brought in roughly 60 people, including parents, siblings, neighbors who were curious about the new sign on the block, and Marcus, who arrived first and spent the whole morning helping Jalen arrange supply stations with a thoroughness that impressed everyone. Sophie was there in her best red coat, self-appointed ambassador, informing everyone who would listen that she knew the founder personally and had seen her sketchbook. Adrian stood near the back of the main room for most of the morning, out of the way, watching. When Claire caught his eye at one point, her hands full of paintbrushes she was distributing, a kid named Omar at her elbow, asking 17 rapid questions about color mixing. He looked at her the way she'd painted him that first night in November. The memorizing look. The one she'd titled The Stranger before she knew him well enough to know it had a different name. She knew its name now. The oldest student at the open house was a 15-year-old named Priya, who had found the studio through her school and who stood in front of the wall of art supplies with an expression Claire recognized bone deep. The look of someone who has been doing the best they can with whatever they could find and has just walked into a room full of the right materials for the first time. Claire went over to her. First time in a real studio? Priya looked at her. Is it that obvious? Yes. In a good way. Claire picked up a brush. A proper one. Sable. The kind that cost what it cost because the alternative was fighting your medium every time. She handed it to Priya. Here, just hold it for a second. Priya held it. Tested the weight, ran the bristles lightly against her palm. That's different, she said quietly. That's what the right tool feels like, Claire said. You're going to make things here that you couldn't make before. Not because you got better overnight, but because you finally have what you actually needed. Priya looked at the brush and then at Claire, and something in her face opened up the way a window opens. The specific, irreplaceable expression of someone who has just been told that the thing they suspected about themselves might actually be true. Claire thought, this is why. Not the space, not the name on the door, not any of the complex, unlikely series of events that had led from a declined card on a November morning to this room on this September afternoon. All of that was scaffolding. This was the thing itself. This was the reason all the other pieces mattered. She spent the rest of the morning moving through the room, fielding questions, showing techniques, watching Jalen work with a group of younger kids with an easy confidence that confirmed every instinct she'd had about hiring him. She watched Omar figure out that red and yellow made more than just orange depending on proportions. She watched a pair of twin girls who'd come in skeptical and were leaving with paint-stained sleeves and plans to return Tuesday. She watched Sophie demonstrate horse drawing to a 6-year-old who had never drawn a horse, employing a pedagogical approach that was clearly lifted directly from Claire's own. Start from the hip joint down, with the absolute authority of a senior practitioner. At some point in the early afternoon, the crowd thinned and the first session wrapped and the room settled into the particular quiet of a space that has been used well for the first time. Adrian was still there. He'd helped fold tables toward the end, alongside Marcus, the two of them working in a companionable near silence that Claire had observed with something between relief and amusement. She'd been slightly worried about that introduction, and it had been, characteristically, less of a thing than she'd built it up to be. Marcus had shaken his hand and said, "So you're the one," and Adrian had said, apparently. And Marcus had said good with a meaning attached to it that Adrian had clearly received, because something in his posture had shifted briefly, the particular shift of a person who has just been told that something matters to someone who matters. She found Adrian near the back corner. Her corner. The separated one she'd designed for the kids who needed adjacent space. Sitting in one of the student chairs, which was slightly too small for him, looking at the room with that quiet, thorough attention. She sat down across from him. "Well," she said. "It's real," he said. "It was always going to be real." "I know, but there's a difference between the plan and the thing." He looked at her. "Priya, You saw that. I saw that. She leaned back in her chair. The room smelled like paint and wood and the slight plasticky smell of new supplies. Through the east-facing windows, September light came in at the specific warm angle of early autumn, which was different from every other season's version of the same direction. More golden, less honest, the kind of light that made things look slightly better than they were, except in this room where things were actually good and the light was just a green. I keep trying to find the moment this started, she said, like the actual moment. Not November, not the cafe, earlier than that. Whatever made me the kind of person who paid for a stranger's breakfast without thinking about it. She paused. My mother did it. That specific thing. She used to say that you couldn't hold kindness back waiting for a better time because the better time didn't always show up. She was right, Adrian said. She was right about most things. Claire looked at the room. I think she would have liked this. What was she like? Like me, but louder, more willing to say the thing directly. She smiled. She would have told you within about 10 minutes that she thought you were worth paying attention to. She would not have waited to see if you could handle it. I appreciate the buffer period you gave me, he said, dry. You needed it. I did, he agreed. They sat in the quiet room in the late afternoon light, and it was one of those moments that didn't require embellishment or architecture. It was simply two people who had found each other through a series of improbable and completely ordinary events, sitting with the thing they'd built, and knowing it was good, and being, for once, willing to admit that without immediately looking for the problem. He found the sketch in October. She'd forgotten it was in her coat pocket, the small one she wore to the cafe, the one that had replaced the broken zipper jacket after she'd finally, in April, replaced the zipper. She'd done the sketch of him one morning before his arrival, from memory, working fast on a page torn from her pocket notepad. She knew his face well enough by then to do it without reference, and she'd caught the thing she'd always wanted to catch, the expression he had when he was watching Sophie and didn't know anyone was looking, the expression she'd spent months trying to name. She'd put it in her pocket, and it had migrated through the laundry cycle somehow without getting destroyed, which was its own small miracle, and she'd found it folded in the lining of the pocket when she reached for her lip balm one morning at the studio. She'd left it out on her drawing table. She hadn't meant to show it to him. It had just been there. He found it on a Saturday when she was in the kitchen, attempting to teach him to properly roast vegetables, a project she had committed to with the same thoroughness she brought to everything, which meant it had become a recurring Saturday event with structured learning objectives. And he'd gone to her drawing table looking for a pen. She heard him go quiet in the way he went quiet when something caught him. She turned around. He was standing at the table holding the small piece of notepaper, looking at the sketch. Is this? He stopped. Yes, she said. When did you? A while ago. She wiped her hands on a dish towel. I draw what I'm thinking about. That's just what I do. He looked at it for a long moment. She watched him look at it. The sketch was good. She knew it was good. She had an honest relationship with her own work. But more than good. It was specific. It was him, the exact quality of him in that unguarded moment she'd observed hundreds of times over months of paying attention. You see me, he said. It came out quiet, slightly rough. I told you in November, she said. First week you came in. I see people. It's a job hazard. He looked up from the sketch. His eyes were doing the thing they did when something had gotten through, the thing she'd learned to recognize as the closest he came to being undone. No, he said. People look at me. You see me. There's a difference. She held his gaze. I know there is. He folded the sketch carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. She let him. She'd painted him a dozen times by now, had him rendered in charcoal and watercolor and oil across multiple surfaces in her apartment. She could part with one small notepaper sketch. He came to her then, crossed the small kitchen, and put his hands on either side of her face, carefully, the way you hold something you don't want to damage, and kissed her in the kitchen that smelled like roasting vegetables, unhurried and certain, the way people kiss when they've been heading towards something for a long time and have finally stopped pretending otherwise. She put her hands on his arms and kissed him back. The vegetables were slightly overcooked. She declared this a learning opportunity, and he agreed, and they ate them anyway. At her small kitchen table with the radio on low, and Sophie called halfway through dinner to report that her grandmother had let her stay up late, and also that she had drawn a very important horse and needed to show Claire immediately, and Adrian put her on speaker and they both looked at the photo Sophie texted. A horse, galloping, full of confidence and motion and very nearly correct anatomy. And Claire said, "That's your best one." And Sophie said, "I know." I counted the legs twice, and Adrian laughed the surprised, caught-off-guard laugh that she was never going to stop being glad to have heard. The evening she said yes, the real yes, not the studio yes, the other yes, was in December. The first December since November, which she'd thought of as the beginning. A full year. It was snowing, which Nashville did rarely enough that it still felt like an event when it happened. Not the heavy, committed snow of places that knew how to do it, but the tentative, wandering Nashville snow that fell in soft increments and made the streetlights look like they were trying harder than usual. They were outside the studio. She'd stayed late finishing a project with Priya, who was 2 months into the program and doing work that had made Jalen come get Claire specifically to look at it. Adrian had come to walk her home the way he'd started doing on evenings when she stayed late, because he said it was too dark, and she said she was fine, and they'd negotiated a compromise where he came and brought coffee, and she didn't call it walking her home even though it was. He had a small box. She'd known from how he was standing that there was something, he'd been carrying something the whole walk, a specific quality of stillness, the way people carry something they've been holding a long time and are ready to put down. He stopped under the streetlight outside Bennett Art House. She stopped too. Snow was coming down in that quiet, unhurried Nashville way. He looked at her. She looked at him. "I had a speech," he said. "What happened to it?" "It sounds wrong when I run it in my head. He exhaled. "Too prepared. You deserve something honest, not prepared." "What's the honest version?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. The snow kept doing what it was doing, indifferent to the moment below it. "I was disappearing," he said, "before you. I was going through everything correctly, and I was disappearing from it, from Sophie, from myself, from anything that required me to be an actual person rather than a functional structure." He held the box but didn't open it yet. "You paid $12 for my daughter's breakfast, and you didn't make it into anything, and I came back the next morning because I didn't know what to do with that. And then I kept coming back because every time I left, I felt more like a person than I had when I arrived. And somewhere along the line that started being about you specifically, and not just about the coffee. But..." She was watching him. The snow in his hair, the streetlight catching the planes of his face. This man who had shown up in her life as a stranger with a declined card and had slowly, stubbornly, become completely indispensable. "I know this is complicated," he said. "I know the money is complicated and my life is complicated and I have a daughter who loves you, which is its own complicated thing. And I know you've had to figure out who you are inside all of that without losing the thread back to yourself." He paused. "I don't think I could have built anything with someone who would have let me make them smaller. That's not what I want. I want exactly who you are, at the full size of who you are." She was going to cry. She could feel it forming somewhere behind her sternum, the specific pressure of something moving. "I was disappearing too," she said. It came out quieter than she intended. "In a different way. Just going through it, surviving correctly, paying the bills and teaching the sessions and calling Marcus and being fine." She looked at him. "You made me stop settling for fine." He opened the box. The ring was not large. It was not a statement. It was a single stone, dark blue, almost the color of the dress she'd worn to that June dinner, the one she'd bought for her mother's memorial and worn the night she realized she could belong in rooms she'd never expected to be in. She had not known until this moment that he'd been paying that much attention. "That color," she said. "You wore it in June. I went looking the next week." He looked at the ring. "It's a sapphire, which is apparently not a conventional choice." "I'm not a conventional choice," she said. "No," he said, "you are not." He went down on one knee in the Nashville snow, which was the kind of thing that would have made her roll her eyes in a movie, and which, in reality, on this specific street, outside the place she'd built with her own name on the door, made her put one hand over her mouth and feel the crying move from behind her sternum all the way up. "Marry me," he said. "However that has to look, however complicated it is. Marry me." She took her hand away from her mouth. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." He stood up. She held out her hand and he put the ring on it and it fit, which later she would ask him about, and he would admit he'd asked Marcus for her ring size, and Marcus had gotten it from the ring she wore on her right hand, and this entire covert operation had apparently taken 3 weeks to execute, which was the most Marcus thing she'd ever heard. He held her face in his hands the way he had in the kitchen. She leaned into it. Sophie's going to be insufferable about being right, he said. Right about what? She told me 2 months ago that I should just ask you. He shook his head slightly. Exact words. Daddy, just ask her. She's going to say yes. She said it like I was being ridiculous about something simple. Claire laughed. The real one. The unself-conscious one. She was right. She usually is. She gets it from somewhere. He looked at her. Not the memorizing look. Something better than that. The look of someone who isn't afraid anymore of what he's looking at. The wedding happened in February, because Sophie had requested February specifically, citing the fact that it would be almost exactly a year and 2 months after she'd told her father to just ask, and she felt this timeline should be honored. It was small by any standard and enormous by Claire's, 30 people in Magnolia Morning, which Deb had closed for the event and decorated with more flowers than the space technically supported, but that somehow worked anyway. Marcus stood up with Claire. Adrian's older brother, who had flown in from Chicago, and who looked like Adrian but taller and louder and more immediately legible, stood with him. Sophie wore red, which she had also specified, and spent a significant portion of the ceremony drawing in her sketchbook with the quiet absorption of a person who has decided this moment is best documented through art. The children from Bennett Art House had made something. That had been Sophie's idea. She'd gone to the studio with Claire one Saturday in January and proposed it with the directness of someone who finds it genuinely baffling when good ideas aren't acted on immediately. They'd made a series of small paintings, one per student, framed in the mismatched frames that lived in the studio's supply room. 23 paintings, each one completely different, hung together on the cafe's back wall in the arrangement Jalen had spent an afternoon getting right. Claire stood in front of them before the ceremony started, in her dress, her hair done for the first time in years, in a way that she'd been talked into by Marcus, who had apparently developed opinions about this, looking at 23 paintings made by children who had not been able to make them in September. Priya's was in the center. It was a woman at a window, loose and warm, the figure slightly blurred at the edges. Claire looked at it for a long time. The woman in Priya's painting was her. She was certain of that, and equally certain that Priya had done it without fully meaning to reveal that, had just painted what she saw and looked at it afterward and decided to include it. It was the best thing in the collection, not because it was about her, but because of what it said about what happened when you gave someone the right tools and the right room and trusted them to show you what they saw. Hey. Marcus appeared at her elbow. He looked at the painting. Is that? Yeah. He was quiet for a moment. Mom would have cried, he said. Mom would have cried immediately, Claire agreed. She wouldn't have waited. She would have walked in and seen it and just... She smiled. No waiting. No waiting, Marcus said. Sophie appeared on her other side, sketchbook tucked under her arm, looking at the paintings with curatorial seriousness. Priya's is the best, she said, but don't tell the others I said that. Why not? Because then they'll feel bad, and I don't want to make anyone feel bad. But it is the best. She looked at Claire. She made you look like you're thinking. Am I thinking in it? Sophie studied the painting. Yes. About something good. Claire looked at the painting. At the woman at the window with the light coming through and the blurred edges and whatever. Priya had seen that she'd rendered in pigment and put on a wall for the world to look at. The thing about kindness. And this was something Claire had thought about a lot over the past year and a half, turning it in her hands like a stone. She was trying to understand the weight of... The thing about kindness was that it didn't require a return. Her mother had said you can't hold kindness back waiting for a better time, and that was right. But it was right for a reason that had nothing to do with what came back. The reason you didn't hold it back was that holding it back cost something. It made you smaller. It made the moment smaller. It turned the possible into the withheld, and withheld things calcified over time into something that felt like caution and was actually just fear. She hadn't paid $12 for a stranger's breakfast because she was auditioning for something. She hadn't done it because she expected it to change her life. She'd done it because a little girl had asked her father if they were okay, and the question had deserved an answer, and the most honest answer she had at that moment was $11 and a handful of change and the willingness to hand it over. What had come back? What had walked through the door every morning for months? What had sat across from her in bookstores and river walks and kitchen tables? What had knelt in the snow outside the place with her name on the door? None of that was payment. That wasn't how it worked. Kindness didn't accumulate interest. It wasn't a transaction with the universe. What Adrian was, what Sophie was, what this room full of flowers and paintings and people was, that was something else. That was the proof of a different theorem entirely, that the life you were capable of was larger than the life you'd settled into. And sometimes all it took to discover that was a moment where you didn't flinch away from what was in front of you. She'd paid $12, and she'd shown up every day after that as herself, fully, without performance. And she'd taught and worked and worried and painted and told the truth in kitchen conversations and on river walks and in the back room of a bookstore on a January afternoon. That was what had done it. Not the $12, not the gesture, the willingness to keep showing up as herself. Marcus took her hand briefly and squeezed it once. She squeezed back. Sophie uncapped a pencil and opened her sketchbook and began drawing the room with the focused serenity of an artist who has learned that the best way to keep something is to put it down on paper. From across the room, Adrian looked at Claire with the expression she'd painted in November and every month since, the one that didn't have a clean name except maybe this. I didn't know I was still capable of this. She looked back at him. 30 people in a small cafe in Nashville. Country music from the speakers. Deb had finally agreed to upgrade, though she'd have strong opinions about the playlist. Yellow winter flowers on every table because Sophie had chosen them. The smell of coffee, which was the smell of where it started and where it always, in some sense, lived. Claire Bennett had $11.47 in her bank account the morning she paid for a stranger's breakfast. She was not poor now in the material sense. That was true, and she held it honestly, knowing what it was and what it wasn't. What she was, what she had been in the process of becoming for 30 years, and was still in the process of becoming, was a person who showed up, who paid attention, who made things, who loved her brother and honored the dead and told the truth in kitchens, and taught children that the space around the thing matters as much as the thing itself. That person had been there before the cafe, before the declined card, before any of it. But it had taken someone seeing her, really seeing her, the way she saw things, with that same patient and relentless attention, to make her believe it was worth something. She believed it now. She walked across the room to the man she was about to marry, and he held out his hand, and she took it, and Sophie looked up from her sketchbook and beamed at both of them with the complete satisfaction of someone who had known all along that this was where it was going. Outside, Nashville was cold and ordinary and alive. The city moved through itself the way it always had, indifferent and beautiful, full of people carrying their specific weights through specific days toward specific moments they couldn't yet see coming. And in a cafe on a street in the middle of it, 30 people stood inside something that had started with $12 and a choice made in under a second, and none of them would ever be able to say exactly when the small thing had become the large thing, because that was how it always went. That was always how it went. Some things don't announce themselves. They just walk in, order a coffee, and stay.